Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a great show for you. We have a couple of fantastic guests. Writer and activist Birrion Sondahl of Real Progressives joined for an interview on his latest editorial, co-written with our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. We also have activists from Occupy Wall Street, Jay Ponti, joining the show to discuss the 10-year anniversary of Occupy and some upcoming events this weekend. A number of important stories to get to. Want to start with Real Progressives plugs as usual. You guys know the drill. If you want to learn more about us or support our organization, find any of our content, articles, podcasts, etc., go to realprogressives.org. You can also find our Patreon there if you'd like to contribute to our organization. Every little bit helps, you guys. We very much appreciate the help. We're engaged in media, education, activism, organizing, all this kind of stuff. So please go to our website if you want to contribute or learn more about us. I also want to show you guys a quick clip here of tonight's episode of the New Untouchables, one of our fantastic series diving into corruption in the financial world. This is an episode with Dennis Kucinich, so make sure you're not missing that, dropping tonight on Real Progress in Action. We'll take a watch of this little teaser, and then we'll come back.
We live in a culture where anything goes, where integrity is seen as passé, where if you stand for something, it's to be ridiculed, actually. It's a very cynical culture. When you see wrongdoing, just the underlying assumption is, well, who are you? Everybody's in on it, and what's your complaint? I mean, I've just seen that in institution after institution. You know, one is almost accused of a certain naivete to raise a question about misspending of funds, of corporate corruption. Just, hey, that's the way of the world. But integrity is the way of the world too. Without integrity, the world falls apart. Integrity is the trust which binds us together. It's the glue that holds a society together. Without integrity, you can't put an airplane in the air. Without integrity, you can't go to a drugstore and buy a product. Without integrity, you have to be afraid of eating your food. There is the unseen power of integrity is that compelling force which binds us all.
Do not miss this episode. Going to be fantastic. I hope to see everybody there tonight. Again, that's Real Progress in Action's YouTube, where you can find the New Untouchables this evening, 8 Eastern. Make sure you don't miss out on that. We're going to start today with a rather horrendous story. I'm sure that some of you have been following the revelations about how the FBI covered for Larry Nassar and his abuse of United States gymnasts, children, girls, under the guise of medical treatment. We're going to watch a few clips here. The first is Simone Biles. A number of gymnasts testified before Congress about their experience in dealing with the FBI throughout this process. So we're going to start with Simone Biles, and then I have a couple other clips to show you guys as well. This was the opening of the proceedings.
I don't want another young gymnast, Olympic athlete, or any individual to experience the horror that I and hundreds of others have endured before, during, and continuing to this day in the wake of the Larry Nassar abuse. To be clear,
Take your time.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse. USA Gymnastics and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee knew that I was abused by their official team doctor long before I was ever made aware of their knowledge. In May of 2015, Rhonda Fayen, the former head of USA Gymnastics women's program, was told by my friend and teammate, Maggie Nichols, that she suspected I, too, was a victim. I didn't understand the magnitude of what all was happening until the Indianapolis Star published its article in the fall of 2016 entitled, "Former USA Gymnastics Doctor Accused of Abuse."
So that was just a short clip there from the intro from Simone Biles. We're now going to watch Allie Reisman, her testimony here.
I want to express my gratitude to the other brave survivors here today, my friends and my teammates, for sharing their stories and continuing to press for justice and reform. Over the past few years, it has become painfully clear how a survivor's healing is affected by the handling of their abuse. And it disgusts me that we are still fighting for the most basic answers and accountability over 6 years later. In 2015, it was known that at least 6 national team athletes had been abused by Nassar. There was even one of the athletes that was abused on film. Given our abuser's unfettered access to children, stopping him should have been a priority. Instead, the following occurred. The FBI failed to interview pertinent parties in a timely manner. It took over 14 months for the FBI to contact me, despite my many requests to be interviewed by them. The records established that Steve Penny, FBI agent Jay Abbott, and their subordinates worked to conceal Nassar's crimes. Steve Penny arranged with the FBI to conduct my interview at the Olympic Training Center, where I was under the control and observation of USA Gymnastics and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. The day of my interview, Steve Penny flew to the Olympic Training Center, and he made sure I was aware he was there. I felt pressured by the FBI to consent to Nassar's plea deal. The agent diminished the significance of my abuse. It made me feel my criminal case wasn't worth pursuing. Special agent in charge of investigating Nassar met Steve Penny for beers to discuss job opportunities in the Olympic movement. Another FBI agent worked with Steve Penny to determine jurisdiction without interviewing the survivors. I've watched multiple high-ranking officials at USAG, USOPC, and FBI resign or retire without explanation of how they may have contributed to the problem, some of whom were publicly thanked for their service and rewarded with severance or bonus money. My reports of abuse were not only buried by USAG, USOPC, but they were also mishandled by federal law enforcement officers who failed to follow their most basic duties. The FBI and others within both USAG and USOPC knew that Nassar molested children and did nothing to restrict his access. Steve Penny and any USAG employee could have walked a few steps to file a report with the Indiana Child Protective Services since they shared the same building. Instead, they quietly allowed Nassar to slip out the side door, knowingly allowing him to continue his work at MSU, Sparrow Hospital, a USAG club, and even run for school board. Nassar found more than 100 new victims to molest. It was like serving innocent children up to a pedophile on a silver platter.
Pretty scathing testimony there. And the last clip that I want to show you guys, this one's a little bit longer. This is Michaela Maroney, and I do want to warn you, she gives some details of the abuse. Again, just absolutely scathing testimony, and I wanted to make sure to show you guys this full clip. So this is Michaela Maroney's testimony about Nassar's abuse.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the Judiciary Committee for inviting me to speak today. As most of you are probably aware, I was molested by the U.S. Gymnastics national team and Olympic team doctor, Larry Nassar. And in actuality, he turned out to be more of a pedophile than he was a doctor. What I'm trying to bring to your attention today is something incredibly disturbing and illegal. After telling my entire story of abuse to the FBI in the summer of 2015, Not only did the FBI not report my abuse, but when they eventually documented my report 17 months later, they made entirely false claims about what I said. After reading the Office of Inspector General's OIG report, I was shocked and deeply disappointed at this narrative they chose to fabricate. They chose to lie about what I said and protect a serial child molester rather than protect not only me, but countless others. My story is one in which Special Agent in Charge Jay Abbott and his subordinates did not want you to hear, and it's time that I tell you. In the summer of 2015, like I said, I was scheduled to speak to the FBI about my abuse with Larry Nassar over the phone. I was too sick to go meet with anyone in person, and talking about this abuse would give me PTSD for days. But I chose to speak about it to try and make a difference and protect others. I remember sitting on my bedroom floor for nearly 3 hours as I told them what happened to me. I hadn't even told my own mother about these facts, but I thought, as uncomfortable and as hard as it was to tell my story, I was going to make a difference, and hopefully protecting others from the same abuse. I answered all of their questions honestly and clearly, and I disclosed all of my molestations I had endured by Nassar to them in extreme detail. They told me to start from the beginning. I told them about the sport of gymnastics, how you make the national team, and how I came to meet Larry Nassar when I was 13 at a Texas camp. I told him that the first thing Larry Nassar ever said to me was to change into shorts with no underwear because that would make it easier for him to work on me. And within minutes, he had his fingers in my vagina. The FBI then immediately asked, "Did he insert his fingers into your rectum?" I said, "No, he never did." They asked if he used gloves. I said, "No, he never did." They asked if this treatment ever helped me. I said, "No, it never did." This treatment was 100% abuse and never gave me any relief. I then told the FBI about Tokyo, the day he gave me a sleeping pill for the plane ride, to then work on me later that night. That evening, I was naked, completely alone, with him on top of me, molesting me for hours. I told them I thought I was going to die that night because there was no way that he would let me go. But he did. I told them I walked the halls of Tokyo Hotel at 2 a.m. at only 15 years old. I began crying at the memory over the phone, and there was just dead silence. I was so shocked at the agent's silence and disregard for my trauma. After that minute of silence, he asked, "Is that all?" Those words in itself was one of the worst moments of this entire process for me. To have my abuse be minimized and disregarded by the people who were supposed to protect me, just to feel like my abuse was not enough. But the truth is, my abuse was enough, and they wanted to cover it up. USA Gymnastics, in concert with the FBI and the Olympic Committee, were working together to conceal that Larry Nassar was a predator. I then proceeded to tell them about London and how he'd signed me up last on his sheet so he could molest me for hours twice a day. I told them how he molested me right before I won my team gold medal, how he gave me presents, bought me caramel macchiatos and bread when I was hungry. I even sent them screenshots of Nassar's last text to me, which was, "Michaela, I love how you see the world with rose-colored glasses. I hope you continue to do so." This was very clear cookie-cutter pedophilia and abuse. And this is important because I told the FBI all of this, and they chose to falsify my report and to not only minimize my abuse, but silence me yet again. I thought, given the severity of this situation, that they would act quickly for the sake of protecting other girls. But instead, it took them 14 months to report anything when Larry Nassar, in my opinion, should have been in jail that day. The FBI, USOC, and USAG sat idly by as dozens of girls and women continued to be molested by Larry Nassar. According to the OIG report, about 14 months after I disclosed my abuse to the FBI, nearly a year and a half later, the FBI agent who interviewed me in 2015 decided to write down my statement, a statement that the OIG report determined to be materially false. Let's be honest. By not taking immediate action from my report, they allowed a child molester, to go free for more than a year. And this inaction directly allowed Nassar's abuse to continue. What is the point of reporting abuse if our own FBI agents are going to take it upon themselves to bury that report in a drawer? They had legal, legitimate evidence of child abuse and did nothing. If they're not going to protect me, I want to know, who are they trying to protect? What's even more upsetting to me is that we know that these FBI agents have committed an obvious crime. They falsified my statement, and that is illegal in itself. Yet no recourse has been taken against them. The Department of Justice refused to prosecute these individuals. Why? Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco couldn't even bring herself to be here today, and it is the Department of Justice's job to hold them accountable. I am tired of waiting for people to do the right thing, because my abuse was enough, and we deserve justice. These individuals clearly violated policies and were negligent in executing their duties, and in doing so, more girls were abused by Larry Nassar for over a year. To not indict these agents is a disservice to me and my teammates. It is a disservice to the system, which was built to protect all of us from abuse. It was a disservice to every victim who suffered needlessly at the hands of Larry Nassar after I spoke up. Why are public servants whose job is to protect getting away with this? This is not justice. Enough is enough. Today, I ask you all to hear my voice. I ask you, please do all that is in your power to ensure that these individuals are held responsible and accountable for ignoring my initial report, for lying about my initial report, and for covering up for a child molester. In closing, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the United States Senate, a very powerful institution that from the very beginning has fought for us rather than against us. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
So that's very powerful testimony there. Scathing testimony. She calls out the Department of Justice. She calls out the FBI. That end bit about the Senate, I think, is perhaps a little bit inaccurate. The Senate, participates in much of the systemic causation for the kinds of abuses that we see from government agencies like the FBI. But that's really a side note. The point is that the Department of Justice and the FBI very much complicit in covering up for Larry and his crimes. And I want to point out, you guys, Special Agent in Charge Jay Abbott emails revealed weeks ago that Jay Abbott was seeking a job with U.S. Olympics. So it looks even worse than just your typical cover-up. It looks like out-and-out quid pro quo, or at least an attempt on behalf of Special Agent Jay Abbott to engage in quid pro quo and let Larry Nassar go for his own political ambitions, or rather career ambitions. And that is even more egregious. And I also want to point out, you guys, that the FBI, just as a general organization, needs to be replaced. It is so spoiled and tainted. The corruption and abuse and exploitation is so cooked into the institution itself, into the agency itself, that it just needs to be replaced. You say the word FBI and everyone at home, you got what, like a couple dozen stories and instances popping into your head where the FBI engaged in horrific abuses of power, whether it was killing activists, prosecuting activists, allowing people to get away with egregious crimes because of their political or economic situations. All of these instances start popping into your head, right? So the FBI just needs to go. I mean, even this whole Gretchen Whitmer thing, the plot against Gretchen Whitmer, it's worth noting that there were more FBI informants involved in this than the actual people that they prosecuted. And it's like this trope that they like to do, where they find vulnerable people or people who might be very confused or in the war on terror days, earlier in the war on terror days, it was like find some fundamentalists and try to basically convince them to commit an act of terror, and then when they do what the FBI convinced them to do, they get arrested for the act itself. And you find out that there were all of these informants that were like pressuring them to do the thing. So the FBI, one of the things they love to do is create these plots and then spoil them. And it does two things for them. First of all, it maintains the fear that they need to justify their existence. They like a terrified populace. That's what they want more than anything. And second of all, it makes them look like, oh, see, we're so necessary. See, we spoiled it. We did it. You know, they get good press for it. And the individual agents usually get, you know, accolades and incredible benefits that come from being one of the agents to quote unquote spoil one of these plots that the FBI themselves formulated. I mean, it's like a classic trope that they do. So the FBI just in general, more often than not, bad actors. This is, and also very involved in sort of the demagoguery of our politics. Like they love to go to the media and play up wedge issues to try to fearmonger and all this kind of bullshit. The FBI is an awful institution. It's an awful agency. It should be gutted and replaced. And once again, here we see how, you know, even in cases of like one of the most disgusting crimes in society, sexually abusing children. It's hard to come up with a more disgusting crime than that. And they allowed him, after Michaela came forward, they allowed him to continue abusing girls for over a year, you guys. So this is what the agency really does. If they're really so effective, how does January 6th happen? They were like openly talking about this shit on social media for months. How does January 6th happen if the FBI is any good at their job at all? No, what they're there to do is fearmonger, terrify the public, create plots to spoil to make themselves look good, and squash political activism. That's what they're there to do. And again, they just need to be replaced. I'm glad to see these accusations coming to light and getting some attention, even in the mainstream media. I'm glad to see the criticism of the FBI making it to the mainstream media. That is a good thing. I'm glad to see that Nassar is finally being held to some form of account and cannot abuse girls anymore. And I want to see as much transparency about this as possible. And I want to see those FBI agents and anyone else in the Department of Justice who engaged in this kind of bullshit, I want to see them held to account of some form. And the more that this story gets out, the more likely that is to occur. So horrendous story there, but it's good to see it coming to light, right? That part is positive. Okay. We have an update here on the situation in Haiti. I've covered this a few times. It's kind of a crazy situation that's happening. And the president, or I'm sorry, the prime minister now has been sort of implicated in the assassination of former President Jovenel Moise, who it gets so messy. So we're just going to go ahead and read here from Reuters. Haiti prime minister fires prosecutor seeking charges against him in president's killing. This is by Sarah Marsh. Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry on Tuesday replaced the chief public prosecutor who had been seeking charges against him as a suspect in the assassination of President Jovenel Moise, plunging the country into a fresh political crisis. Moise was shot dead on July 7th when assassins stormed his private residence in the hills above Port-au-Prince. The 53-year-old had been governing by decree for more than a year after Haiti failed to hold legislative and municipal elections amid a political gridlock and had faced many calls to step down. His death has left Haiti in an even deeper constitutional and political crisis, as it has only a handful of elected officials nationwide. Henry, a political moderate and neurosurgeon whom Moise named prime minister just days before his death in an attempt to reduce political tensions, has sought to forge a new consensus between different political factions. But allegations over his possible involvement in Moise's killing are now overshadowing that. Prosecutor Bedford Claude said last week that phone records showed Henry had twice communicated with a man believed to be the mastermind behind Moise's killing on the night of the crime. That suspect, a former Justice Ministry official whom Henry has publicly defended, is now on the run. Henry dismissed his request to discuss the matter as politicking and did not respond to the allegations. That prompted, I'm reading like shit today, Claude to write on Tuesday to the judge overseeing the investigation into Moise's slaying and ask him to charge Henry as a suspect. He also wrote to Haitian Migration Services ordering them not to let the prime minister leave the country due to serious presumption relative to the assassination of the president. Later on Tuesday, a letter from Henry to Claude dated September 13th emerged in which he said he was firing him for grave administrative error without going into detail. In a separate letter dated September 14th, he named France Louis Just, excuse me if I get that name wrong, to the post. So this it's an already insane situation. You guys, there's so much like corruption and self-interest going on between all of the players in this whole ordeal. As I've mentioned before, the United States was supporting Moise as he overstayed his term, as he refused to hold elections, which meant that their legislative bodies were left very short. The Senate's supposed to have 30 members. It only had 10 because those elections were not held. Moise was himself trying to rewrite the Constitution at the time of his assassination. And then the United States supported Ariel Henry. So it seems like they were supporting both sides of this. They supported his appointing Henry to prime minister, who now appears to be implicated in Moise's death. So the United States on both sides of this, kind of like, well, in a very different way, but kind of like how the United States was on both sides of the Syrian civil war, and probably is still on both sides of the Syrian civil war. So this is just an absolute clusterfuck. I really don't know how else to term it. This is a complete mess, and it's very hard to know who to trust or who to listen to or what the situation is down there. And we'll see what happens going forward. Haiti obviously has been pretty well destroyed by the United States foreign policy. They had at one point the only successful slave rebellion that I'm aware of. It was a great success story. And then you had the Duvalier family, the Baby Doc and Papa Doc, come in and just oppress the poor to degrees that are very hard to describe. You'd struggle to find a regime in the history of the world that can compete with the way that they oppress the poor. United States supported that, and now had supported Moise as he unilaterally made changes to the Constitution and held office without any elections at all. So our role in this has been a very bad role, and it's contributed to the unrest and the destabilization of Haiti that has allowed for the situation that currently exists, which is one of deep confusion and unrest. So we'll keep up with that story as new developments come to light. I want to talk about the drone strike in Kabul that the Pentagon has now come forward and basically admitted was a war crime and did not kill any ISIS targets. This is a crazy story for those of you who haven't been following it. The United States executed a strike against a man that they claimed was a member of ISIS. Turns out he was not at all a member of ISIS, killing him and his children as he returned home. The drone had been following him for hours and waited until he pulled into his house, and his kids jumped into the car with him, as they apparently did whenever he got home, to fire and killed a bunch of children and civilians. This is just a horrendous story. I have a clip here. This is actually CNN that went and talked with the family members of those killed. I want to compliment them for covering it at all, but I also have a criticism of some of the way that it's framed. So we'll watch this clip and then come back and I'll explain what I mean.
Family, and you have spoken to some of them. What have you learned about them?
Yeah, this is a family, the Ahmadi family, that are really still in shock. They can't understand, with all this high-tech surveillance, how the military, how the Pentagon couldn't have known that there were civilians in the area, because it's a very densely populated neighborhood with tiny, narrow back alleys, and their children were out at the front when the father was coming home at the end of his day's work. This was the moment for them to enjoy some fun time with their father father, and they were helping guide his vehicle into the compound, and they would do what they always do when he came home with the water, which was pile in the vehicle with him, you know, have some fun with him, and then help him get the water out. But of course, that was the moment when the missile struck. To go back and talk to the family now is really just to touch and feel that pain that they're going through.
Like this. This is the blood of children.
This is the blood of the children up here?
Yeah.
Imal Ahmadi shows me his family's shattered house. It's just heartbreaking to see this now. And to know that they say that it was just a mistake.
Yeah, that's a big mistake of you. This house is black. You know about it, yeah?
No one has had the heart to clean it up since the drone strike 3 weeks ago.
They are all of them innocent. Like my cute daughter that I can't forget her. She was so lovely for me. I remember all of them.
The Pentagon's late admission, though, that his brother Zimari was not an ISIS terrorist, something positive.
The USA has proved that they are targeted innocent people. Because of that, I'm so happy about this news.
But he still has questions. 5 children, he says, were inside the car when it was hit.
The USA know that in this area inside the car was children. Why they targeted an innocent person in this area? Why they targeted civilian person?
So far, they say they've had no.
So again, I'm glad that they covered it. It's devastating. I'm glad that they actually went and spoke to a family member of the victims. But that ending bit where they tried to frame it as though this guy was like somehow very pleased with the United States admitting what they had done here. No. What he was saying, at least in my interpretation, he was saying like they never even do that. So I'm glad to see they did. But it's still a fucking war crime. He still killed a bunch of children. Like, for CNN to try to frame that like, oh, it's a positive. That's gross. That's disgusting. That's so beyond the pale. Imagine if like Russia had done what we just did. Would CNN be saying, well, it's so great that Putin admitted what he did? Of course they wouldn't. It's so absurd, the hypocrisy, the rank hypocrisy that you see on these cable news outlets. So this drone strike, the Pentagon came out and basically admitted they knew that civilians were present, that children were present, and they went forward with it anyway. Didn't kill any ISIS members, nothing. And the worst part to me, not even the worst part, that's an additionally egregious part, is that it's pretty clear that Biden did this out of political need, out of he wanted to not look weak after the withdrawal went poorly, right? Obviously, I support pulling out of Afghanistan, you guys. I've covered this at length. There's some nuance here. But when the attack at Kabul airport happened, it made Biden look pretty fucking bad. When the Taliban so quickly swept through Afghanistan and took it over, it made the Biden administration and U.S. intelligence look pretty fucking bad. So it seems clear to me that the reason for this drone strike was, no, see, I'm not weak. You're not going to call me weak. I think it was, he politicized the whole thing, and he went and killed a bunch of children and civilians over his political need to not look weak. How pathetic is that? In a way, like just on surface level psychology, how weak is that? To sit there and be so terrified of a bad news cycle that you will kill children? How pathetically weak is that? Yet, of course, in the United States, that's not how it's perceived. Our media presents it the exact opposite. Our media sides with bullies. Our media defends bullies. It's outrageous. This, of course, is one of many instances of the United States killing civilians. There was a report about the Obama administration's drone strikes that said over 90% of those killed by Obama's drones were civilians. The man who received a fucking Nobel Peace Prize, one of the many recipients that turned that prize into an absolute laughingstock, in my opinion. But the point is, this is nothing really new for the United States. It's just business as usual. Except for their having to admit it. They usually just try to sweep it under the rug, and they will, going forward, try to sweep this one under the rug. And the hypocrisy there is just outrageous, you guys, because they want to claim, like, look, we're fighting all these jihadist groups and look at all of the horrendous attacks that they do around the world. It's like, okay, well, you don't really get any ground to stand on to complain about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban if you're sitting there and executing these kinds of drone strikes, if you're sitting there and supporting the ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank, if you're sitting there and supporting Saudi Arabia as they executed genocide against Yemen. You don't have ground to stand on. It's rank hypocrisy. And again, as I've said a number of times, our presence in the Middle East contributes significantly to the destabilization that allows for the power vacuum, that allows for these groups to take power in the first place. So all of this violence really does, in many ways, trace back to United States foreign policy. And the violence at Kabul airport, the drone strike here, no different. This is all part of this whole couple of decade long, or really, I mean, even longer than that, but in its most recent form, the last couple decades of U.S. foreign policy. So I wanted to make sure to cover that. We murdered a bunch of children. Shame on Joe Biden. He's a war criminal. Shame on all of those officials at the Pentagon who decided to go forward with this strike. You're war criminals. You have blood on your hands. You killed fucking children. You belong at the Hague. Okay? That's all there is to that. Sticking with the Pentagon, there was a study by Brown University. I'm going to show you guys here an article in the Associated Press. Study, Pentagon reliance on contractors hurt U.S. in 9/11 wars. This is by Ellen Nickmeyer. Up to half of the $14 trillion spent by the Pentagon since 9/11 went to for-profit defense contractors, a study released Monday found. It's the latest work to argue the U.S. reliance on private corporations for war zone duties that used to be done by troops contributed to mission failure in Afghanistan. In the post-9/11 wars, U.S. corporations contracted by the Defense Department not only handled war zone logistics, like running fuel convoys and staffing chow lines, but performing mission-crucial work like training and equipping Afghan security forces that collapsed last month as the Taliban swept the country. Within weeks and before the U.S. military had even completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban easily routed an Afghan government and military that Americans had spent 20 years and billions of dollars to stand up. President Joe Biden placed blame squarely on the Afghans themselves. Quote, "We gave them every chance," he said last month. "What we could not provide them was the will to fight." But William Harding, the author of Monday's study by Brown University's Cost of War Project and the Center for International Policy, and others, say it's essential that Americans examine what role the reliance on private contractors played in the post-9/11 wars. In Afghanistan, that included contractors allegedly paying protection money to warlords and the Taliban themselves, and the Defense Department insisting on equipping the Afghan Air Force with complex Black Hawk helicopters and other aircraft that few but U.S. contractors knew how to maintain. So they would insist that the Afghan military use U.S.-made Black Hawk helicopters, which only us and our contractors, or pretty exclusively us and our contractors, could even operate. The Afghans actually, if you read further into this article, wanted to use the Russian-made helicopters instead. It was better for their needs, and yet we insisted that they use ours for purposes that trace back, obviously, to the military-industrial complex and the drive for profits at these companies and at the contractors that operate them. So great study there from Brown University that reveals some of the ins and outs of the military-industrial complex and how it took place in Afghanistan. At this point, I would like to bring in my first guest today. Occupy activist Jay Ponti joins the show. Jay, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me, Luke.
So if you just wanted to start by introducing yourself and how you got involved with activism and things like that. How did Occupy come to be a decade ago?
Yeah, I've been working as a community organizer since 2001, but Occupy Wall Street was really my foray into leftist organizing. And it was one of the most profound awakenings, I believe, in our nation's history. And certainly for me, it really directly impacted me in 2011. I'd been involved in sort of organizing around, peace causes, but I wasn't that deeply entrenched in anti-militarism and the police, looking at the police state. And And I went down to Occupy LA, and it was just amazing. It was like this punk rock circus. There were 200 tents for about 2 months, and there was always vibrant discussions. There were teach-ins, trainings, people talking about different ideas. Yeah, it was just like this punk rock circus. There were about 1,000 people. And for me, that was such an incredible moment because, you know, if somebody had come to you and been like, hey, I got this idea, let's get 1,000 people together and let's go lay siege to City Hall for a couple months, you'd think they were absolutely insane. And yet that is exactly what happened. And it happened, maybe not in those numbers, but it happened all over the world. And it really did shake the political establishment to its foundations. We know that the mayors across the country, sheriffs across the country were having conference calls to strategize how they could take us down. And for me, like I got to directly, it was the first time I really directly experienced police repression. You know, I got hit in the ribs, jabbed in the ribs with a police baton. And, you know, we were standing on the side on the first night they came to take down the camp. It actually took them 2 nights to take us down. The first night they came, there were about 1,500 riot police that created a huge perimeter. But the second night we were standing, and they actually came in through the basement and through the doors of the south step, and they sort of came out like it looked like a swarm of wasps, you know, just sort of descending into that. And so that's, you know, for me, like I got involved because some of my friends were doing a rally for Oza Motley and Robert Reich. And I had, you know, I had done a lot of concerts, a lot of punk rock, a lot of DIY shows, you know, big peace rallies and concerts, that kind of thing. And so they called for help, and I just instantly fell in love and just spent a lot of time down there. But yeah, I really like, that's one of the things that gets lost is people forget that, you know, the mainstream narrative is that it was just a bunch of hippies who didn't know what they wanted, but it really was very serious. It was driven by very serious activists, very serious leftists who, you know, I guess it was a really profound moment of radicalization, certainly for myself and quite a lot of people, but you don't really get it. You can get it conceptually, you can read the books, you can get the theory, but until you've experienced that level of repression directly, you just can't get it. It's the same thing we experienced, you know, at Standing Rock, and had, you know, people experienced that during the George Floyd uprisings, of course, and lots of other instances of Black Lives Matter organizing. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question. Did I miss
100%? It did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm quite fascinated actually before we get into some of the impacts that Occupy's had in some of the upcoming events. I'm really, you mentioned there like concerts and how that was your organizing background. Can you just talk about how like you said, it's kind of perceived as though it was an unserious thing, but can you talk about how that pop culture and that fun side kind of can actually tie into effective, serious organizing, and how it's important for us to use pop culture and this kind of thing to our benefit?
Yeah, to me, this has been always been one of my go-to tactics, especially for, you know, for poor people. You know, we don't have the infinite resources of some of the consultancies, you know, some of those, you know, like the consultant firms that the banks and oil companies hire and the political parties hire have unlimited resources, right, to run astroturf operations, which they do. But for us, there's a reason why the conservatives, for instance, constantly denigrate Hollywood. And that's because Hollywood is incredibly cultural influencers are very powerful. And I think not enough leftists have read Gramsci and in the Prison Notebooks and understand the concept of cultural hegemony. So cultural hegemony is how the corporate state conditions us to be obedient, and it is in the drinking water. You know, there's a reason why the Department of Defense spends hundreds of millions of dollars funding your favorite action movies. They fund everything from it started with Top Gun, actually. That was the first time And that was coming in an age when sentiments were at an all-time low about the military because of Vietnam, and Top Gun boosted enlistments like exponentially. They had the people at the DoD had recruiting centers at these movie theaters, and they've been doing it ever since, spending this much money, and it's all over. This is a time-tested tactic and strategy that the corporate state uses. So I am of the organizing school and philosophy of people like Abby Hoffman and the Yes Men, who use culture to influence public opinion. Abby Hoffman, I think, was really one of the best at that, doing some of these stunts. So I've always found that not everybody has access to celebrity. I live in Los Angeles, so that has always put me in a unique position. But I helped book surrogates for the Bernie Sanders campaign. And that was one of the biggest tactics. When Killer Mike came on board, I didn't bring Killer Mike into the campaign. I brought a lot of other actors and bands into a lot of the people you saw opening up for Bernie. Like, I organized a team that basically recruited and organized those surrogates. And it's a very effective tactic, because the moment Killer Mike comes on board for the burn, it sends a huge moment. It sends a huge message. So I believe that's a very important tactic. I think leftists, a lot of time, we and progressives fall victim to a term we call prefiguratism, where we end up focusing on the performative aspects versus the overall strategic aspects of how are we going to number one, how are we going to change culture, and how are we going to change policy? If you're not changing culture and you're not changing policy, really, you're spinning your wheels, in my opinion. So I'm not sure
I think that in today's world, and sometimes I think to a fault, like, culture drives our politics right now to a very large degree. Whether you love or hate that, that's kind of just a reality, and you should probably use it to your best benefit. And just to add to what you were saying, you mentioned Vietnam. Like, look at what Muhammad Ali did by protesting the draft. That's a prime example of it right there. And also, you mentioned Hollywood and how they're often paid for by the Pentagon, or at least approved kind of by the Pentagon. Another instance of that, I think, would be during the whole Kaepernick debacle. It came out that they were paying $20-some million a year to the NFL to do these flag ceremonies before games and fly jets over the stadiums and all this kind of. It puts the military in a certain light, right? It's propaganda in an explicit way.
Yeah, and then basically they draw a direct correlation that any protest where the flag is present, you're automatically disrespecting the military.
Yep.
You're automatically disrespecting the troops. So it's absolutely, that's cultural hegemony. And it's not to say that certainly quite a lot of, Hollywood are stakeholders in the ruling class. That's of course the we saw that with the people who stumped for Hillary. There was definitely a clear battle between the two. But a lot of those people also that came out for Bernie showed up at Occupy. Susan Sarandon was down at Occupy. A lot of those people showed up at Occupy, and that also was a big moment. At the end of the day, for me, if an action is not really generating press, and if the optics around that press are not moving the needle, just generating like confrontive conversation, how do I say this? Like, on the left, we end up taking a lot of prefigurative and performative actions because I don't think a lot of us believe we can win. Mm-hmm. And so we end up defining ourselves by the fight. And if we define ourselves by the fight, we feel good that we stood outside of a building with a bullhorn. Yeah. And you got to ask, like, what am I doing moving the needle? Also, I think when you define yourself by the fight, you end up fighting everyone, even your allies and your comrades. Yes. And we're seeing this a lot with, now I personally don't believe any politician's coming to save us. No one's coming to save us. Like AOC is not coming to save us. Bernie's not coming to save us. Nobody's coming to save us. That's one of the things that I think a lot of us occupiers understood, is that it was really up to us. And we had to organize our own protests. We had to organize our own actions. We had to build power. Bernie, a lot of people don't realize that the Bernie Sanders campaign itself was a direct manifestation of Occupy Wall Street activists who saw the dangers of a Clinton administration. It was, everyone knew that she was the presumptive nominee. It was like a fait accompli, and so they very seriously, some of them initially were tried to recruit Elizabeth Warren, and they started an initiative called Ready for Warren, and she basically told them to fuck off, literally, like literally told them to fuck off. And then they decided, they always had the plan that they would pivot to Bernie. And they did, and they actually activated what was called 99 events for the 99%. They sent it out to the whole Occupy mailing list, and a lot of those events became those affinity groups for Bernie. Like, you know, Black Men for Bernie, I think, came out of that. Stan Williams, I think, organized that, and then there was a bunch of all of those groups that you saw on social media, on Facebook, came out of that. A lot of them came out of that original organizing. And based on what I know from talking to, you know, very close sources, Bernie would not have run if he hadn't seen there was a substantial grassroots movement behind him. And I think it's also lost that was the real power. I think that's one of the reasons why we lost in 2020, is because there was a huge shift from 2016 to 2020, where 2016 was very much really driven by the grassroots. And I think in 2020, what happened is we noticed a big shift where I think there was an assumption like, oh, the campaigns got it. And I think that was a big, I think that was a very bad assumption on a lot of our parts for a long time. And some people saw it early on, but by then it was too late. We relied on the campaign. What was magical about 2016 is that it really was the first time where social media and the grassroots really were the real political power behind that. And I think we just assumed that the and there was in 2020, there were quite a lot more establishment consultants that came into the foray. And so we lost that. So again, like, for me, that there's an important lesson there to unpack. So I'm not sure.
100%. I think that's a critical point to make. I mean, like it's in 2016, Bernie had even gone so far as to say that in one interview, he said he was hoping Elizabeth Warren was going to run. And when she didn't, he dove in. So it's like Bernie clearly reacted to the moment in what I think most activists would want to see from a progressive politician like that. And then unfortunately in 2020, it did seem to drift away from that grassroots feel. I think Bernie, a lot of his success was born out of that activism in the independent media, because the mainstream press wasn't going to give him anything. So he needed that grassroots, you know what I mean, base for him to have any success at all. So I'm curious to ask, you kind of just touched on some of this stuff. I think in an almost incalculable way, Occupy has affected our politics just on what you just said alone, that the movement itself was so fueled by this. But I'm curious, looking back over 10 years, what do you think was successful about Occupy, and what do you think could have maybe been done a little bit better?
That's a great question. I think what was successful is, number one, it got people out of the house. In the age of like end stage capitalism, we have experienced such intense atomization, which means that like you used to have community structures, neighborhoods, you had Elks clubs, unions. These are structures that brought people together, brought communities together. But late stage capitalism has, especially in the last 30, 40 years, really divided us so that we think we're separate, different, alone. You feel alone. And what Occupy did is it got people out of the house and together. And we learned that, it got people out from behind the keyboard. So many people, fancy themselves progressives or leftists. They never get out behind the keyboard. They just think that, like some of us call it slacktivism, but there is no real, and again, it's great that you are sharing memes and all that, but one of the things it did is it got people out of the house, got people having teach-ins and having debates in person. You cannot really have a meaningful exchange of ideas online. It's not set up for that. it's just online is not a place where you can really have a meaningful exchange of ideas. So number one, it got people out of the house. It got people exchanging ideas. And beyond that, I think that it was a huge moment for many of us who were new to organizing in leftist organizing against the corporate state and the police state, where we realized that you have to also build political power. So that a lot of the theory of change behind Occupy, was around this idea of a leaderless movement, and we didn't need to work with elected officials. But what a lot of us discovered is how easily the corporate state can dismantle you. A lot of us said, we're not leaving. No, you are leaving because they are organized. The banks, the stakeholders, the elected officials, the sheriffs, they are working together in a highly strategic manner to end your movement. And we need to work we need to be just as sophisticated. They have almost unlimited supplies of people who graduated from top universities who sit in war rooms thinking about how they're going to fuck your shit up. That's real. And yet for us, it's a lot of times it's like the Bad News Bears meets the New York Yankees, right? So a lot of us discovered that there is no theory of change that does not, there is no viable theory of change without also building inside power. And this is what unions have always done. It's collective bargaining. You have the power of grassroots direct action combined with an inside-outside theory. What you have to have a meaningful dialogue with stakeholders and being able to leverage the power of that grassroots action to put pressure on those stakeholders. It's how Slick and Martin Luther King and the other civil rights leaders won the Voting Act against, LBJ was a straight up racist
out and out. Yeah.
Out and out. Like he was a Dixiecrat. Straight up Southern racist, but they were able to create enough political pressure, both culturally and with direct action. And a lot of us learned that same lesson, which is why the Occupy activists started focusing on some of those, started occupying the structures of power. And that does not mean standing for or supporting these political parties. Does not mean that. But I believe there's also a strand of the very unproductive left that will abandon that. And it just, if you're not changing the policies and changing the laws and the budgets and how our society is structured, nothing is really significantly changing. That
I
doesn't
100%
mean
agree.
that local efforts like mutual aid are important. They are important, but that was one of the things that we did in terms of a theory of change. That's one of the things that many of us came away with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a nuanced thing. Can you touch a little bit on how would you walk the line of effectively kind of grabbing power and having an organic power structure form without crossing the principle of a democratized movement? Those two things can kind of, for a lot of people, rub up against each other. And then secondarily, how do you walk the line of, I think to your point, there are people who are anti-establishment just for the point of being anti-establishment. And the goal should be to grab establishment, to become the powers that be. But if you're just going to oppose the powers that be constantly, then when you take power, you're at risk of some of your movement falling off. So how do you walk these nuanced lines in your view to maintain as strong a movement as possible?
Well, for me, it comes down to broad coalitions. And that's one of the things that a lot of the OG occupiers we've been talking about, in some of our spoke council talks, is this idea. We've learned a lot. Our ideas have evolved. We learned that Occupy, for instance, really did not center people of color enough in 2011. It really was very white. Now there were definitely a lot of people of color who were on the front lines and organizing, doing great work, but in general, we did not center those issues enough. And you cannot extricate systemic racism from industrial capitalism. You just can't. So I think that's one of the things that we've really learned since then, is to embrace intersectionality. That's been a big one. But for me, the theory of change is that the power centers in coalition building. you can do the most effective change on a local level, right? So we in LA, a group called Divest LA that I organize with. I didn't lead those actions, but I definitely worked with and helped organize some direct actions with them. They pushed, we pushed Wells Fargo Los Angeles City Hall to divest $8 billion from Wells Fargo and changed the actual way that our city does business, unbundled 800 accounts and changed the request for proposal process so that number one, previously only the top 5 big banks could handle that much business. But by unbundling by getting the city council to unbundle those 800 accounts, that means that a number of smaller mid-level banks that were not invested in pipelines or corporate prisons or immigrant detention centers, weapons manufacturers, and all of a sudden those smaller banks would be prioritized. Actually, there's a ranking system. There's like a point system. So if you're invested in pipelines, you go to the bottom automatically, right? So, and this involved a lot of deep work, but keep in mind, this was a group of millennials who had no resources whatsoever, but they really thought it out very clearly. Like they really thought it out really clearly. So for me, how do you not get absorbed by the political establishment? Keep in mind, the system is absolutely corrupt. So this is one of the reasons why having your coalitions have a continuing dialogue with your stakeholders is absolutely crucial. And we saw it for a minute with AOC working with Sunrise. Remember in the beginning, Sunrise occupied Pelosi's offices. So that was like a snapshot. And I think there wasn't much follow through afterwards. So if you're not maintaining meaningful relationships with those coalitions, then it becomes easier for then your political stakeholders have to just work within that corrupt system. And as you see, like the Congressional Progressive Caucus not really leveraging the power that they could be if we were having more meaningful coalitions. So, but from an organizer's perspective, we do what's called power mapping. And I think not enough leftists and progressives understand the concept of power mapping.
Can you give a brief explanation of that?
Yeah, sure. So you make a grid with 4 quadrants, and you have two axes. And on one axis, you chart what is the level of influence that they have from not influential to the most influential. And then on the vertical axis, you chart are they opposition or ally, right? So if you look on this axis, they fall either opposition or ally. Now you can tell someone like Kristen Sinema is not an ally.
Right.
We know that Joe Manchin, we know they are owned by fossil fuels. We got that from an Exxon. Greenpeace did a great action where they tricked an Exxon executive who thought they were in a job interview to basically give the entire playbook. It was awesome. You Google it. Google the Exxon 11. It was actually pretty great tactic. And we know that they're not. We know that they're owned. They are owned, bought and paid for. On the other hand, you have people like Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, others who are more on the like solid ally. They come. Cori Bush, Black Lives Matter activist. She's one of Rashida, organizer. She's one of us, right?
Yeah. So
you have influence and you have allyship. So. But we have to also look at, like, Sunrise has Sunrise has its issues as well, but they have a great philosophy and no permanent friends, no permanent allies. We just look at elected tactics. They are tactics, and they're either opposition or they're allies. And you have to work with your allies to effectively organize. And this is what unions have always done. It's what the Christian fundamentalists do. It's what the NRA does very, very effectively. These are absolute fringe minority groups who have built an enormous amount of power, leveraging their grassroots and organizing them. And leftists and a lot of leftists, don't think about this. They don't
Well,
think
it
about
seems like it becomes more about virtue signaling your position online and feeling like that is somehow doing something, as opposed to like actually trying to seize power. And I really want to underscore the point you just made, because we talked briefly about Johnson. If you can force a bad politician to do a good thing, you should celebrate that. And it seems like there are factions of the left that would be like, oh, such and such group sold out to whoever is now doing this good thing, and it's, I think we just need to look at politicians in power in a fundamentally different way from that. I do want to get here to the upcoming events this weekend, but first you mentioned some banking stuff down there in LA, and you're also the co-founder of Bank Exit. Can you just explain what that is and what you guys do?
Yeah. So, the Bernie surrogates, we organized in 2016. And pretty much right away, Shailene Woodley was part of our group, and she was one of the ones who really got us into Standing Rock early. So we were pretty much directly right after the convention. Even at the convention, we were organizing for Standing Rock at the DNC in 2016, and so she really helped raise awareness for us about what was going on in Standing Rock. We got involved early and started organizing earlier on that. And then, a lot of us who were not on the ground there until we had not yet gotten on the ground there. We kept seeing the violence escalating. And for me, there was this moment when it was Indigenous Peoples Day. And one of my friend and comrades who's an Indigenous organizer named George Funmaker was giving a speech, and he said, "Hey, who's got their money in the bank?" He goes, "What? I'm the only one?" And I went, "Oh my God, that's right." Mm-hmm. And I remember during Occupy, there was a movement called Bank Transfer Day. And so they were just protesting. I think Bank of America was trying to jack their ATM fees up to $5, but through a Facebook page, a few people, this was during Occupy, basically threatened to take all of their money out. There was like 50 or 60,000 people who were organized and said, "We're going to take all our money out if you go through with this policy." And they got Bank of America to reverse the policy. So I remember, I was like, it was just that. And so we had a group, our affinity group basically was getting drone footage and getting footage from the front lines and then pushing it out to mainstream media sources. And we got some footage. Jordan Cheriton was in our group. And Jordan sent us some drone footage that the pipeline, the Black Snake, had reached the river, basically. And so I just started throwing out some Hail Marys. I had been trying to get a lot of the orgs on board for like a month, and I just wasn't getting any traction. Everybody was more focused on their own tactics. So I threw a Hail Mary. I sent a group text to Susan Sarandon and Shailene, saying, "Hey, this is my idea. This is what I think we should do." And Susan said, "Great." I was already planning on divesting. And I asked her if she would get on an organizing call. She said yes. Then I used that organizing call to reach out to other stakeholders. People like Dennis Kucinich was on that call, and other Matthew Cook, who made this amazing video for us. And there were a bunch of other people. There were some great activists. David Braun was on that call from the Californians Against Fracking. And we, so Susan being on that call really got everybody's attention. My plan was that we were going to go to Standing Rock. We were going to film the Indigenous leadership making the request, come back and ask people. But Susan, by the time we had the call, Susan had already booked going on CNN, TYT, and BBC. And that was actually the famous interview where she said she doesn't vote for her vagina. She doesn't vote with her vagina, right? They were trying to get her on.
I remember that. Yeah.
Right. So that was that interview. And, we generated something like, I literally created the petition while I was like, oh shit. Like, okay. She's going on. So basically I told her that, and she's like, "Oh yeah, that's a great plan. Only I'm going on CNN in a couple hours." And so I literally created the petition on my cell phone while we were on the conference call.
Oh, that's so funny.
Right. And so I literally put up, and we got 100,000 people in like 4 days to commit to taking their money out of the banks. And it just it blew up. And then many of us went to Standing Rock after, and, you know, a lot of the time at Standing Rock, you know, we really kept pushing for that idea of divestment and then it kept then people, you know, there was a group in Seattle called Mazaskatoks who then took it to a whole other level, working with Kshama Sawant, again, inside, outside. Kshama Sawant was an Occupy activist who became one of the first socialists who was a city council member.
And now there's a couple other socialists on Seattle City Council, by the way. I'm in Western Washington. I was raised in the Seattle area. She very much changed the environment there. I do want to, and by the way, the point you just made, I think, speaks to what we started this discussion about, which is look at what the people who have that kind of platform, what engaging with some of that pop culture can do, right? That's immediately you're on CNN and you're getting all this attention for it. And also a quick shameless plug for Real Progressives. You mentioned Dennis Kucinich. Make sure you don't miss tonight's episode of The New Untouchables, where we talk about financial corruption, which features Dennis Kucinich tonight at 8 Eastern. So just quick shameless plug there. I want to get on to what's happening this weekend. Can you just talk a little bit about the events that are going down to celebrate this 10th anniversary and what people can do to get involved?
Yeah, sure. So this past Friday was the 17th, was the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and there were events in a number of cities like Zuccotti Park, and there will continue to be events in Boston, as I believe their official anniversary of Occupy Boston is September 30th, I believe. So, but there's going to continue to be Occupy events happening. More importantly, we believe that it's important for people to look at the coming actions and continue. It's the most important for us to start getting out of our silos, right? So we think about like, oh, this is my issue. I'm really only about income inequality, or I'm really only about anti-militarism. I'm only all of these, or I'm about climate. You cannot extricate these issues. You know, you cannot extricate industrial capitalism from systemic racism, from the climate apocalypse, from health justice. If you're a poor person of color, you're probably you're more like fossil fuel projects most adversely impact poor communities of color, which is going to mean they're going to have a lot of health problems. So you don't have single payer, you don't have Medicare for all. Once you get sick, you know, so you cannot separate these problems. So we believe that, and I'll speak for myself. But this is a conversation many of us have had. So we really believe that people need to start standing with Line 3, the indigenous activists who are always the tip of the spear fighting climate change. They're the ones that are putting their bodies on the line consistently. So we hope you look up Line 3, go to Line 3, like the same repression that was happening at Standing Rock is happening yet again with Line 3. It's, you know, we believe in supporting them. There are some Food and Water Watches organizing some actions against on COP26, the climate summit. There's a Nabisco strike happening, so we need to be in solidarity with them.
It actually just ended yesterday.
Oh,
they came to an agreement that got them a raise and a $5,000 bonus and no more gutting of their health care. So it seemed like they at least got something. So yeah.
Nice.
But I didn't mean to continue.
I've been in the weeds. You know, we've been working in LA. What we're doing is we're supporting the youth climate strike. So on coming up next weekend, starting Friday, there's going to be a global action with the youth climate strike. But we are really focusing on supporting their efforts. So they will be occupying City Hall starting at 10 a.m. They will be camping out on the front lawn. Bring a tent. There's going to be teach-ins. There's going to be theater. There's going to be activities all day for 24 hours, actually, 24 hours of programming. And Lil Dicky, I heard, just got confirmed to play outside of City Hall, which is going to be super fun. So we're really trying to support the youth. And then we'll be having like a little ceremony and rally and concert at noon to conclude their actions. But you know, you can look up Youth Climate Strike wherever you're at. There's actions all over the place. If you're in LA, come on down, bring a tent, should be fun. Come on out to support us.
That's fantastic. And when you say we, do you mean Occupy will be picking up the festivities from there?
Directly. So again, like I don't speak for Occupy. There are some OG Occupy organizers who we have been coming together. But there's all sorts of other, like, a lot of us have continued to organize on a local level since Bernie and Standing Rock. We just continue to fight together, and we like each other. A lot of us actually like each other. And so, there's a bunch of wonderful orgs like, 350, and there are indigenous organizers. And, so we're trying to broaden the circle right now, to just kind of bring those pieces together, because we're on the precipice of another eviction crisis. It's really serious. We could be facing another 2008 collapse.
Yeah.
Like we're imminently, like the eviction moratoriums are, a lot of cities are just about to end those.
On the precipice of it. It's really right here. Yeah.
Really could get very, very, very bad. So, we're trying to have deeper conversations with our local organizers, and to see where are the places that we can be more strategic and working together, sharing information, because it's like, again, it's just too siloed. We're not sharing information enough. We're not organizing effectively enough. I'll just give you this one little example. There is a guy named Grover Norquist, who is like a right-wing. He's like kind of like a Bond villain a little bit. He's like a Steve Bannon kind of libertarian figure, but he's a very good organizer, and he's very smart.
That's a bad combination.
Even if he's a complete and utter tool, he's very smart. And one of the things that he does is he organizes this thing called the Wednesday meeting. I know this, I'm not sure if it's still going, but I know it used to come on, where he would bring together, imagine the worst Venn diagram possible of like Christian fundamentalists, NRA people, ALEC, corporate lobbyists, libertarian think tank people, and they get into a room, and these people don't like each other. They're all a bunch of nutbags, and they do not like each other. And yet they understand the importance of building power and solidarity. And so basically everyone will get a chance to say what they're up to. Everyone will say, this is what I'm working on. And he'll say, okay, if you want to work on that project, there they are. Right. And elected officials show up to that. So they actually have a really solid theory of change, which is how they were able to take over the government with a minority of the population, a really small segment of the population taking power. And those who claim to be anti-fascist are conceding power. It's really frustrating. But that is actually a good snapshot of how to organize effectively and build power, build coalitions, even with people you don't like. Here, it's sort of like, and to me, it's our culture on the left is just, it's suffused with rank consumerism. It's actually consumerism, because we look at our version of leftist politics like my version is the most organic kombucha. My policymaker or my ideology is the most organic kombucha, and everyone else is wrong, right?
Yes.
It has nothing to do with building power. It has nothing to do with strategic organizing. Nothing changes. It's just more consumerism, because we are conditioned to believe that the market will take care of whatever we want, because we've been marketed to and advertised to our whole life. So we think it's AOC's job. We think it's Bernie's job. We think it's the squad. And when they don't do exactly what we want, the way we want, then we get very angry.
Yeah. And I think it also teaches us to view things in too much of an individual way. Like instead of looking at a power system as a whole, we take an individual actor within the system and either cast them into the good or the bad bucket. And then we work backwards from those conclusions as we evaluate everything going forward. And it really just amounts to more of this character assassination or character compliments instead of actual power and politics.
That's right.
And I wanted to just ask
solidarity.
No, nothing at all. It's quite the opposite. It's actually driving wedges between people who might agree on 95% of issues, which is just insane. But yeah,
and a lot of YouTube, I appreciate you having this conversation, because a lot of the YouTubers are driving this.
Oh, man.
And keep in mind, this is their business model.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I don't believe that it is overt. I don't believe it's conscious, but I do believe unconsciously they are incentivized, because guess what? My AOC call out videos get the most clicks.
Yes.
The
And
most
even if
clicks,
that's
right?
very subconscious, even if it's like, you know, if for people who this is their what they want to do, and you see that result, you're going to end up gravitating towards it whether you want to or not. And that's, I think, an unfortunate incentive that's built in, is it makes the left so easy to divide over these stupid personality bullshit issues. I wanted to get your just general thoughts right now. I tend to be quite pessimistic as I evaluate things in politics, and I think it's hard not to be that way on the left sometimes. But can you give me some optimism? What do you see right now in the activism and organizing worlds and in the political world that gives you cause for hope?
Well, I would say this is one of the benefits of getting out from behind the keyboard. This is one of the reasons why we got it. You got to get out into the world. And I know it's difficult during the pandemic, but you can still organize virtually. I think that's also, when I say get out from behind the keyboard, get off of fucking social media and do something. When you work together in affinity groups, it is incredibly powerful. There has been a burgeoning network since Occupy, through Bernie, through Standing Rock, through Black Lives Matter, of organizers all over the country who now know each other. This has never, ever happened before in the history of American politics. It's not in the way that it is. There is a vast network. We see what we're doing. We're working together. You know, the internet has given us the ability to mobilize quickly. And by the way, I am so impressed with these youth. It's like working with the youth climate strike organizers. These kids are fucking amazing. And if we can just stand with them and behind them, and not swoop in, not try to come in a top-down paternalistic way, but really to lift them up and empower them, show up for them, support them in a way that they feel is supported. If we can just keep it together long enough without dividing into factionalism, without all of this bullshit infighting, I believe this next generation really does have the power to make the big change. Because y'all don't remember what it was like organizing during the Obama administration. It was dark. Y'all don't know what it was like unless you're an OG. You don't know what it was like before Bernie. We lived in a very, very different, a post 9/11 world was a dark place to be a leftist organizer. DSA had 5,000 members. Now it's like 100,000 members. It was a dark time, and it was. We were talking about the wars that Obama was waging, the drone wars, the NDAA, the failed state in Libya, the efforts to. Luckily, I think our pressure stopped a lot of those efforts to create a hot war in Syria. But y'all don't remember. It was dark. It was very hard to get anybody to pay attention. And of course, when a bunch of Occupy activists tried to get Bernie to run, of course, the left was like, this is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Right. And it was this most, so you need a different mental model. We need a different, and it's you got to look at the marathon mindset. You got to play the long game and not, I can understand how if you were activated in 2016 or 2020, how it could be demoralizing, how you can make up, there's no point to doing it. The Democratic Party, for instance, is where movements go to die. I get it. But that doesn't mean you support the Democratic Party. But if you do not take power away from them, if you do not take away their power, if you do not take that structure of power, it is a duopoly. That means that's how it runs. Like, if you admit there's a duopoly, there's no theory of change if you don't take that structure of power. And if you don't understand cultural hegemony, you're not going to get that general strike you want.
Yeah.
Everyone says, we'll just do a general strike. I'm like, all right, we'll go fucking do it. See how you do.
Yeah.
See how you do. I will apply,
To take an attitude that essentially willfully leaves yourself out of the discussion is kind of just a really pathetic position from the start. I think we need to just be more realistic about power, and whether we love or hate institutions, we need to take power from them, and we need to stop criticizing lefties who are trying to. I think is really key.
I'm trying to find, where's that book? There is a book here called this. By the way, this is a well curated. It's not an accident these books are here. Like my interview shelf, but there is a book here. This is the one. this book should be, every single leftist should own this book. Every single one. This, like, I wish this could be passed out to activists, like, you know, they pass out free samples at Costco. This book talks a lot about prefiguratism and moving away from performative activism, which includes your online call outs, y'all. Y'all think you're doing something by calling out AOC's dress. You're not doing anything except generating more. And that doesn't mean we should give anyone a pass.
No, of course not.
When AOC gives a shit take, absolutely, she
yes,
deserves
or
to
refuses to use power in a way that's substantive. Of course, we should critique it. But
absolutely,
no, it's a fucking dress. I mean, for God's sake, why was half my Twitter feed full of a fucking dress? It's insane.
Because people aren't doing anything. They're because people feel powerless. They feel angry. And the only avenue that they see right now is to complain online. And that is understandable. It is understandable. It is understandable to be demoralized and to be angry and to say, like, hey, I thought AOC was going to do all of this great stuff. That is, it makes sense that you would feel that way. And that perspective is colored by the fact that you're probably not working with other humans in a meaningful way to actually organize around an issue or a policy or something like that. If you are like this book really talks about the word prefiguratism. Learn the word prefiguratism, learn what it means. It skips over the strategic element of politics. You need to have a vision, have an outcome, have a goal. You can't just end systemic racism. You can't just end capitalism. It doesn't just end itself. It means it requires a big vision. You know, stop breaking your campaign into vision, mission, goals, strategies, tactics, and a theory of change. Think it through, right? Yeah. And you can do it there's so much you can do on a local level. There really is. Like, it's amazing how much you can do on a local level by organizing effectively. And by the way,
that local level can then come back to pay off in big elections, right? If you organize locally, then by the time we actually get to the point where we may seize some power and a Bernie-like candidate comes along, you have the local infrastructure to help him in your area, right? Or a Senate candidate in your state, whatever it might be. Like, the big goals that we have to actually seize the most powerful institutions can be significantly benefited from that local community building, and grabbing power right now while we can at a local level.
Yeah, and also look at campaigns as tactics themselves to shit. Like, for instance, I helped run the Shahid Buttar campaign against Nancy Pelosi. There really wasn't we didn't really have a shot in hell of winning, right? But that was a campaign we were able to push for me, I got into that campaign because I wanted to push the Overton window on nationalizing fossil fuels, which we did. And, you know, we pushed a lot of other really important issues. But our local coalitions, the local divestment coalition was influenced by the Seattle local coalition, who pushed with Kashama Sawant and Mazda Skatas working to, and I think Seattle 350 was there too, pushing, you know, to divest, right? Which inspired LA, which inspired other cities. That LA group also looked at what was happening and realized, we're going to change the laws, but the banks are going to continue to fight us to roll back those changes, which is why we need public banking, right? Public banking. And so that one, I would say that Oakland Occupy activists like Susan Harmon has been working on it since Occupy. People have been working on it, but this LA group, I do believe, made significant strides in actually taking this issue. Not only have they recently passed AB 1177 in the State House of California, in the State Senate, but they've passed multiple bills for public banking, which, by the way, is the most anti-capitalist platform right now, because it literally cuts out the Federal Reserve and nationalizes a city or state's tax dollars, which instead of paying, literally, like LA, for instance, pays $100 million, pays $100 million out in fees to banks. Imagine what you could do with that $100 million if, you know, locally, if it's not being paid to the banks in fees for managing the money. So small group, a handful of people influenced, like basically reshaping American politics and the American political landscape. So you got to get
and
the keyboard.
And just to emphasize, like we know at the federal level that MMT teaches us that money is not perceived correctly when we think, well, we need a tax to spend. But when you're talking about a city like LA, they do actually have to bank with somebody, and they are financially constrained, and they do rely on tax dollars to fund any social expenditures. So when you're talking about that kind of waste of fees, that's directly harming the local constituency. So I know this kind of goes counter to some of the things you've been saying, but I've had Jay's Twitter up this whole time, Jay Ponti. Please go follow Jay, even though he wants you to get out from behind that keyboard. Following his Twitter can give you the events to go do so, right? Keep you up to date on what's going on.
Really
and Jay, can you just reiterate how people? Oh, good. Yeah,
I'm not like I don't really go on Twitter. It's just a cesspool. I really actually should be on it.
Yeah.
I'm not on it that much. I mean, I'm on Facebook quite a lot. There's a lot of organizing happening on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, you can follow me there. There's also, I'm working on a website, jponti.com. I loathe all these things. I like to be in with the people, but I'm working on getting better at it. I'm working on it. So
well, you can at least share and try to build what you're doing on the ground through these, right? And try to garner attention for them. So follow Jay wherever you can. And can you just reiterate how people can get involved this weekend and going forward with some of the organizations that you think are...
Google Youth Climate Strike. You Google Youth Climate Strike Los Angeles, and it's just show up to City Hall. The kids are going to be there. We'll, setting up tents from 10 a.m. Come on, bring a tent. If you want to come for the Little Dicky show, that's going to be fun. Extinction Rebellion is going to be doing some theater and called The Cult of Oil, and it's good, wholesome fun. So I just recommend we're trying to make it as safe as possible. So bring your mask. And also, here's the thing. You might support MMT, you might not support that, but the thing is like we're not going to come together and these are very nuanced ideas. We're not going to solve it arguing online. But if you and I have this conversation together, we can have a deeper conversation about MMT. I might not understand how MMT works, so you got to lean in and not just say you're wrong, you're an asshole, you're a class traitor, whatever it is. And it's very black and white thinking. Also consider you're not going to go to from oligarchy to, communist revolution or whatever your vision is
overnight.
It's just not going to happen. Learn your history. Look at what they did, the 99 World Trade Organization, WTO organizers, how they organized those actions. They spent 9 months working with the unions and to effectively organize that Battle of Seattle. Learn your history, learn your movement history. So
100%. And I totally agree too that I telling someone you disagree in person is such a different conversation than trying to tell somebody on Twitter that you disagree. It just comes off as a personal insult when you're on Twitter. And of course, we're all going to disagree about different things, and it's healthy to discuss those things. But when you're actually face to face with another human being, that's bound to be a much more productive conversation than when you're sitting behind a screen. I could not agree any more with that. So
and you never know you never know when a liberal is going to have a life-changing event. They could have a surgery that puts them they could have their house foreclosed on. You never know when a liberal might be radicalized. So always look as people as potential allies. And it's like Plato's allegory of the cave, right? You cannot go to the people who are in the cave looking at the shadows in the wall, calling them assholes and class traitors. And my version of fucking Trotskyism is the right one. You're an asshole. Stop being an asshole, right?
And
maybe I'm doing that right now. Maybe I'm actually succumbing to that same thing right now.
No, it's a couple layers deeper. At least you're saying please engage in a way that's productive. I could not possibly agree more. 100%.
Lean in, give people the benefit of the doubt. Realize that everybody has read if you're not organizing, like Fred Hampton used to say, like, theory is cool, but if you're not organizing, like, it ain't shit. It's not praxis. You know, like your theory doesn't really mean much until you get into the field and put it to the test. So
100% the case, yes. And I just want to emphasize the treat everybody like a potential ally. I voted for Barack Obama. I now obviously regret that, but at one point in time, I would have had a very different view of things until I was exposed to, right? Don't look at somebody as though they're permanently entrenched in their current positions. Look at them as potential allies. I think that's a great point there, Jay. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It was really great to talk with you. I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, sure. Would love to. And I appreciate you holding space for the show. And I appreciate, Real Progressives dedication, because like y'all get into it. Like Real Progressives are in the mix on our organizing calls, not just not doing a YouTube show. Like the Real Progressives are. I got asked to do this because one of your comrades was in one of our organizing groups for Occupy the Youth Climate Strike, right? So
absolutely. Yep. And shout out there to our co-editor in chief, Virginia Kotz. Shout out to Virginia. We do all sorts of activism, organizing, media, education. We try to get involved in every way that we possibly can. I appreciate that. Shout out there, Jay. We'll look forward to talking again soon. Thanks again. All right.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Bye. So I thought that was a fantastic discussion. Really great to speak with Jay there. And really urge everybody to get involved however you can this coming weekend. If you're in LA, make sure to join the festivities there at City Hall and look into that youth climate strike around the country if you are elsewhere. Really just cannot encourage people enough to get involved on the ground. Like Jay said, get out from behind that keyboard and go get involved, meet other people that are organizing, network, community build, all this kind of stuff. Even if you're just getting involved on the local level, it does more good than a lot of people could possibly realize. It gets a snowball effect going in a positive way. So I wanted to get back to a story that kind of connects with the stories I was talking about before I discussed the Occupy stuff with Jay. That is that the CIA and NSA, we were talking about the Pentagon and contractors, right? And how the military industrial complex has been so detrimental to our foreign policy. The intelligence community is also involved in a similar scheme, right? And it's come out that ex-CIA and ex-NSA officials are effectively able to like sell the information that they have because they have U.S. Clearances. So I'm going to show you guys a clip here. This is Crystal Ball from Breaking Points, who went over some of these details and I thought covered them quite well. So I'm going to show you this clip about the bones of the story, and then we'll come back and discuss.
Deep state story for you here. This one about the CIA. This is actually, there's a lot to this story. Let's go ahead and throw this New York Times tear sheet up on the screen. So ex-U.S. intelligence officers admit to hacking crimes in work for the Emiratis. The lead is 3 former American intelligence officers hired by the UAE to carry out sophisticated cyber operations admitted to hacking crimes and to violating U.S. export laws that restrict the transfer of military technology to foreign governments. That's according to court documents that were just made public. Those 3 men, Mark Baer, Riot Adams, and Daniel Garicki, they admitted violating U.S. laws as part of a 3-year deferred prosecution agreement. If the men comply with that agreement, the Justice Department will drop the criminal prosecution. They will also pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, and they will also never be able to receive a U.S. government security clearance again. So here's the backstory with all of this, and bear with me for a moment because I went deep on this story because there's a lot going on here. The CIA has been warning that there's a real problem with their former officers who, understand all of our deepest tools of spycraft and hacking and all of this in this global cybersecurity world are now getting hired by other countries for hundreds and thousands of dollars to go and apply their tradecraft from that they learned the CIA, sometimes against now our own people. So these former intelligence officers are selling themselves to the highest bidder, to go and do nefarious work for whatever government is willing to pay them the highest price. The way that this particular thing went down is initially these dudes, they were part of a company called Cyberpoint that was doing what it looks like to be at least legal, if not entirely legitimate work for the UAE. UAE kept pushing them to go further and engage in illegal hacking activities, including some allegedly targeting American citizens themselves. So since they were with Cyberpoint and Cyberpoint was like legitimate and registered with the US government, et cetera, They were unwilling to do everything the Emiratis wanted. So the Emiratis started this other company called Dark Matter, got a bunch of the employees from Cyberpoint to go over to Dark Matter, and Dark Matter starts doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So one of the things that they did, and I don't know if you guys remember this story. Remember the story about how baby monitors could be turned into spying devices?
This was a huge thing. Yeah.
That was dark matter, okay? These guys were doing things like that to spy on perceived enemies and adversaries of the UAE. So that's dark matter, but they're far from the only firm that's engaged in this type of nefarious activity. In fact, the biggest, sort of most notorious one at this point is this group called NSO, that we told you about before. It's an Israeli-based firm. They're the ones that developed this Pegasus spyware that can literally take over your phone and without you even clicking on anything. So you don't even have to get like a phishing email or a weird text or whatever. They can just take over your phone and get access to everything that you have, everything you're doing there, including your encrypted apps. And they're selling it to the Mexican government. They're selling it to some of the Gulf states, all these actors that claim, oh, we're just going to use it in legitimate ways to combat crime, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, they were using it to target journalists, to target activists, to track, in Saudi's instance, the people who were around surrounding Jamal Khashoggi. Thousands of people, heads of state, prime ministers, all of these people being tracked by this Pegasus app. And so all American, Israeli, and other top intelligence officers around the world being recruited into these incredibly nefarious and oftentimes illegal lines of work. So this is just a glimpse into one small instance of what was going on here.
I just really want to underscore that last point, you guys. This is just one specific story. It's a pattern of how this stuff goes. That revolving door between the private and public sectors is all too pervasive in a number of different sort of fields. And this is not immune to it at all. Intelligence not immune to it at all. And you know, it creates a whole number of dangers, right? Because the contractors in question have their own incentives to continue to profit as much as possible. So if you have this revolving door where characters are working with both intelligence agencies and these contractors, then the intelligence agencies obviously start to behave in ways that are beneficial to those contractors and their bottom line. You can see how this immediately creates a perverse incentive structure for the intelligence community, which already out of self-preservation has a perverse incentive structure to fearmonger and to lie to the population, and all this kind of stuff, to propagandize all this kind of stuff, right? That's really what their job is. Like, what is the CIA there for? What's the NSA there for? Okay. Another point to drive home is that there often is, you know, this has been revealed by leakers over the years, but there often is information gathering on Americans by the CIA and the NSA, which is not supposed to be legal at all. And they always claim, well, they're not our targets. We just end up with information about them. And, you know, these gray areas are incredibly dangerous, especially when we give these agencies the ability to basically claim national security prevents us from being transparent about any of this, right? So an industry that is particularly susceptible to this kind of abuse gets to turn around and redact stuff from reports and censor what's actually happening and refuse to engage in any form of transparency under the guise of national security, right? Same with the Pentagon, same with the military industrial complex in its more original form, that we talked a little bit about earlier today, and how that affected the way that we handled Afghanistan and the rest of the Middle East. So it's pretty much always bad when you have public interests being swayed by these private contractors and their own rapacious incentive structure, right? It's almost always bad. And it's particularly bad when we're talking about government agencies that have additional powers, you know, like intelligence, like the military, where they can kind of just avoid any question or any scrutiny by claiming, oh no, it's about national security, I can't tell you, right? Anyhow, I want to move on here to a very sort of unique story. This one's kind of close to my heart. I am an absolute sports nerd, for those who haven't been watching long enough to know that about me. When I want to turn my brain off and not think about how fucked up the world is, I go to sports. Well, we have a little bit of a convergence of the two here. This is a clip from More Perfect Union about how minor league baseball players are exploited by the MLB and how they make very little money and have to live in poor conditions while they're trying to make it up to the big leagues. So this is More Perfect Union. I show their clips quite a bit. Want to give them a huge shout out. And if you're not following their work, encourage you to do so. They're always reporting on labor organizing and workplace organizing and all this kind of stuff. So we'll watch this clip, come back and discuss.
My heart to see, because this is the game that I've loved since I was a child. And I want to see it be the best it can possibly be. And its employees are being treated like commodities, like cattle to be traded. If they're a show cow, great. Put them in the fair. If they're not, put them in the slaughterhouse. Baseball can be a lot more than where we have it now. The higher-ups have become so comfortable with how cheap it is to run the minor leagues that they figure it's a successful model. And from a business standpoint, it might be. But from a human standpoint, it's a massive failure. When a player is first drafted, they are picked up by a team and signed to a 7-year minimum contract. That 7-year minor league minimum contract entails a certain amount of pay at each level. We are considered seasonal employees, thanks to some clever lobbying by the MLB. We can legally not be paid a living wage. At one point we did the math for the amount of hours that we spent at the field, and it came out to about $4 an hour. Now I think it's up to about $7. It still is about half of the going rate, considering we work roughly 60 hours a week. The income is impossible to live on, plain and simple. So we're in a 3-bedroom. We have 2 in one bedroom, 2 in the one I'm in right now, and a master bedroom. This room is split in half, and I probably have, 10 by 5? And that's kind of my space. That's my little area, and this is my roommate's area. But at one point this season, he and I were having to share this bed because I didn't have a bed yet, and we weren't even sure if I was going to get one in at the time. Typically you have mattresses on the floor, and that's it. Maybe a couch in the living room or a TV that you get from Walmart that you're gonna return in 90 days and get your money back. The basic creature comforts that we've come to know in modern society do not exist for minor leaguers. The food quality is absolutely not adequate for athletic performance. Some teams were okay providing nothing but like a ham and cheese sandwich and some chips. If you're in Kodak, Tennessee and the food's not good, your only option at night is to walk to Taco Bell. You should never defer to Taco Bell. Taco Bell's last resort, always. There's a deep, kind of pervasive sadness that underpins this game at times. I had a suicide attempt in the winter of 2015, going into 16, where I was living in downtown Phoenix. I was rehabbing from a hip surgery, and at the time I was just drinking. And I just remember one night being like, man, it's just not worth it. I'm not doing anything. I'm not helping anybody. Throughout the years, I've watched the mental health of guys deteriorate, whether it leads to substance abuse, whether it leads to depression, anxiety, or just leaving the game behind.
Now the set by Lovegrove, 2-2. Swing and a miss. Fastball at 98.
The talent level in the minor leagues is equivalent to Major League Baseball minus the consistency. Every game that you go to, you'll have a guy throwing upper 90s. You'll have a guy hitting a ball 450 feet. The difference is they're doing it eating Stouffer's mac and cheese and some dry chicken, with baseball's $12 billion revenue in 2019, and the fact that the combined worth of the owners is about $75 billion. It feels like a direct slap in the face to everyone who puts on the cleats and goes out there and plays for the organizations, that we are giving our bodies, hearts, minds, souls to this game, and the payoff coming back to some players is negative. I mean, less than minimal. Like I said, guys are losing money. Guys are losing health. Guys are losing weight. That to me did not make sense. And I tried to rationalize it every possible way I could. I just couldn't find an answer for it.
So fantastic clip there, you guys. I think we often think of, it's obviously ridiculous that like the top athletes end up making hundreds of millions of dollars. Not that, I mean, it's incredible talent. It's an incredible ability. I'm glad that people who enjoy sports can have the entertainment, and but that's outrageous. We won't pay firemen or paramedics or nurses or teachers, but we have no problem paying, an elite baseball player a few $100 million. Well, the downside to that, insane amount of money that you can make playing professional sports is this. It's all the people who don't make it. It's all the people who put years into training and working to become a big league ball player or whatever other form of athlete, and then getting stuck in a system that exploits them, right? And the other thing I want to point out, you guys, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was actually quite an ordeal, because a bunch of minor league teams just disappeared. They said we can't survive the pandemic, so we're gone. And Bernie spoke up about this and tried to get Congress to bail the minor leagues out, because they are like small local communities can really get interested and involved and behind their minor league teams, and it can become a community thing. And these guys also need to be paid adequately for the entertainment that they're providing. So, workers' rights should apply to absolutely everybody. We've covered a lot of strikes on this show in the recent months. We've talked a lot about like how Amazon exploits their workers. We've talked about the OnlyFans situation and how sex workers are exploited. And I thought this was an interesting way to show how pervasive that is throughout our society. Even in industries that we think of as at times being grossly overpaid, there are still people being very much exploited by those industries. And I would also point out, baseball makes, I can't remember what they said, 16 billion, I think, a year. And very much that is very much built on the employees at the stadium. It's, the people selling beer and hot dogs and running the parking lot and all that kind of stuff. Like those people are not paid very well, but that beer that you paid $12 for is going straight to the billionaire owner, right? So there's all of these industries are so exploitative, even when you look at the very top earners in that industry and think, Jesus Christ, they don't deserve that, right? No one deserves $300 million for being an elite athlete. That's insane that we've designed a society where that's what the market demands, right? So I hope that this effort will work. I hope that minor leaguers are given better treatment. The owners certainly can afford it. They're making so much freaking money. It's insane. And they should have to treat their employees. That's what these are. Baseball players are employees of these billionaires. They need to treat them better. It's just that there's no other way to put that, right? And this also very much translates to like football and hockey, where even guys who make really good money, think about what they're doing. They're sacrificing their own health, their body, their mental health, right? We've learned a lot about what the head injuries in these contact sports do to people later in life. They're dying earlier. They're becoming, in some cases, violent. Guys who never were violent before end up being violent and kind of like losing their minds. I mean, that's a hell of a sacrifice to be making. And if people want to make that sacrifice, they should be compensated quite handsomely for it, right? So I wanted to point out that there are a lot of industries that don't necessarily come front of mind that do engage in the same exploitative behavior as all of the industries that I'm sure we all work in and experience and have understandings of, right? So I would like to now show an interview that I did earlier this week. This is with Birrion Sondahl. He's an activist and writer with Real Progressives. He has a number of fantastic editorials on our website. Go to realprogressives.org if you want to find Birrion's work. This is us discussing the latest piece that he co-authored with our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. So it's about, truth versus unity and how disruption can be a good thing for movements and things of that nature. So this was a really fantastic interview with Birrion. Encourage you all to follow his work. Enjoy. I am very happy to be here with Birrion Sondahl. He is a writer and activist with Real Progressives. Birrion, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about an article that you wrote with our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. I was hoping to read a little bit from the start of this, and then we can dive into the substance of it. It's for those viewers at home, please go to realprogressives.org if you want to find our articles and podcasts and all sorts of great content. This is titled Anti-Intellectualism and the Death of the Movement. You guys start with a quote here from Eugene Debs. All explorers, pathfinders in religion, morals, science, government, geography, in any and every department of human affairs are agitators. They are seldom or never popular in the beginning of their labors. Their fate, as a rule, is to suffer derision, contumely, neglect, and poverty, often penalties still more severe, and the exception only vindicates the rule. Can you talk a little bit about what that represents and how you see it playing out in today's politics?
Yeah, so I kind of see Eugene Debs as, he's a big figure in the socialist movement in the United States. And this was from an article of his on agitation. And essentially he is arguing that, without agitators, nothing is going to change. We're going to be stuck with the status quo. And that's kind of what we see today is, unless people are willing to get out there and make the changes that are necessary and speak power, truth to power, then we're just going to be stuck going on this same path, the status quo, which is what kind of Joe Biden and the establishment, Democrats and Republicans represent.
And can you tie this in a little bit with MMT in maybe a broader sense and how the establishment responds to criticism of the almost dogmatic views about the monetary system that we see as sort of the mainstream perception?
Yeah, we're seeing this kind of, austerity politics really from a lot of the establishment. I guess right now the villain of the day is Joe Manchin, who is continually saying that he's not going to approve this $3.5 trillion spending bill. And, coming from a MMT standpoint, this $3.5 trillion is nothing compared to what we actually need to be spending. It's like we have the resources, we need to take direct action and spend far more than 3.5 trillion. But what we have these beltway politicians are saying, we have to raise taxes to pay for this, and we can't be raising taxes. It's like, we don't need to worry about the pay-fors right now. What we need to worry about is fixing the infrastructure and addressing climate change.
100%. Yeah. You guys also quoted later in the article here another Debs quote that I thought was great. The wranglers over creeds and dogmas are perhaps the most persistent of all agitators, the bedrock idea being that a wrong exists which must be found and exterminated. So to flip it to the other side, you were talking about the establishment there. How does this setup end up? How does this leave the people who are speaking about MMT perceived in a general sense?
And I guess they're being seen, as agitators, I suppose would be the way I'd take that. MMT is not widely accepted. We see more the Paul Krugman School of Economics, where they're not advocating large spending, want to make cuts rather than keep on spending on the people. So I guess, there's all these very dogmatic, stuck in the mud positions who refuse to acknowledge that MMT is correct about the way that the federal financing works.
And in your view, I mean, I've tried to maybe diagnose this a little bit in different ways, and I can see some of the dynamics that might lead people to think this way. I think some of it is a little bit natural, just because what money means to us is so fundamentally different than what it means to a currency issuing government. And there's also obviously the propaganda element. But what factors do you think lead to an environment where it is so misunderstood and misdiagnosed?
Yeah, I agree that propaganda element is a huge part of it. And then also just our entire education system is designed to mislead people about the fundamental truths of, not only MMT, but, things like socialism, Marxism, communism. Those things aren't actually taught in school. Rather, we're just taught that capitalism is the be all and the end all. And, ignoring MMT is another way to prop up the capitalist system. It's like, they're willing to spend these trillions of dollars on wars in Afghanistan that are going directly to private contractors. But when it comes to actually spending on something like, universal health care or a Green New Deal, suddenly, how are we going to pay for it comes up. And that's the question that we heard in the Bernie campaigns, like, how are we going to pay for it? But you never heard about it. Estimates of what we spent on the war on terror, I think, start at $14 trillion over the last 20 years. So.
Yeah, never a question about that, right? Never going to wonder where we're going to find that money for. Yeah, I think it's odd that there's this sort of preconceived notion that seems to be very universally accepted in our society, that like I'll hear people say all the time, and I really mean like well-meaning progressive-minded people will say things like, well, I'm socially progressive, but I'm fiscally conservative, as though it's like a virtue signal to say that, as though it's inherently going to bring on respect to say something like I'm fiscally conservative. Do you think we're making headways on those issues and getting people to look at this differently? How far behind in the game do you view us?
I think some progress has been made. I mean, you look at Congressman John Yarmouth. He's read the deficit myth, and he was willing to speak out about it. I think there's probably a few people in Congress. I know AOC has pushed some MMT angles before, as far as like the Green New Deal goes. So at least there's a few people who are willing to speak up on the matter, but for the most part, it seems like they're still stuck in this, tax to pay for spending. I know Joe Biden's been tweeting a lot about, well, we have to tax the rich to pay for this infrastructure bill, and that's not actually a helpful way to, look at this. It's like we have to tax the rich, but not to pay for anything.
Yeah. It's its own separate issue. We need to tax the rich for reasons that are like separate of the policies that we're talking about here. Did you see? I thought Stephanie Kelton's talk, her TED talk, quite recently. I believe it was in August. Was really fantastic. It was only maybe like 12 or 14 minutes long or something, but she really, I thought, got MMT across quite plainly. Do you see the mainstream coming around to that, or are you more hopeful that everyday people will begin to accept this and therefore sort of change the whole perception?
I think it needs to be a combination of the two, really. I think as everyday people learn about MMT, they're going to get angry, that the government's willing to spend on war, but not on basic necessities like healthcare, housing, food. So then there'll be pressure from the bottom for the people at the top to actually, change the thinking. And, even this minimal $3.5 trillion bill is progress of a sort. It's one of the biggest spending bills we've seen in a long time. So I guess that is it's progress. It's not what we need entirely, but it is progress.
Yeah, I've tried to cover that with nuance. It's certainly far from adequate, but I also hope it passes, and that's a weird thing for some people to kind of walk that line. I'm curious what got you into MMT, I think for me, one of the things it sort of sparked my outrage, kind of like what you were just talking about. And I think Kelton sums this up with the quote that once the MMT coin drops, you realize the suffering is gratuitous. And I think once I realized, like, I used to think that it was incompetence on behalf of Congress that was leaving our country as it is. When you learn MMT, you really realize it's a choice, like a very explicit choice that legislators are making. And I'm just curious what sort of sparked your outrage in this regard. What got you into MMT and viewing the world from this perspective?
I think I learned about MMT during Bernie's first campaign. And Stephanie Kelton was his economic advisor, so I kind of looked into the whole thing then, and that's when I kind of started learning about it. And then at some point in there, started following Real Progressives and following Steve, and when Macro and Cheese came out, started listening to Macro and Cheese and learned a lot more about MMT through the podcast. So it's just kind of been a ongoing process since Bernie's first campaign.
Gotcha. Right on. Yeah. And quick plug for any of the viewers that have not watched Steve's podcast or listened to Steve's podcast, rather, Macro and Cheese drops on Saturdays. Fantastic work. He has all sorts of great guests on, covers all sorts of issues from that MMT lens. I wanted to read here just a couple paragraphs from the start of this article. Knowledge is power, yet it is reviled by much of the population. Unity is created, but at the cost of truth. This is as true on the left as it is on the right. Progress does not come through acquiescence to the status quo and continuing to live in a myth of federal deficits and taxpayer-funded spending. Agitation shakes up the status quo and is seen as divisive, but progress is not possible without agitation. Many in this movement have failed to learn from the mistakes of the past. From the 2016 campaign, where Hillary Clinton lied and mocked Bernie Sanders' attempts to provide for the common good, to the 2020 election, when a veritable army of primary challengers repeated neoliberal talking points, the media fed into these lies with the repeated question of how are you going to pay for it, a question which is designed to weaken enthusiasm for big systemic changes like a Green New Deal or Medicare for All. Bernie came up with a series of pay-fors that were unnecessary in a country with monetary sovereignty. So that brings a couple of questions up. I was hoping you could first just kind of distinguish the difference between divisiveness and agitation, because while they're perceived to be very, very much the same, I think there's an important distinction there. Can you kind of explain?
Yeah, I mean, like, you look at people who are looking to actually divide the movement, and that's where divisiveness comes in. Splitters, it's kind of a COINTELPRO sort of approach.
Yeah.
It's like you claim you're on their side. Like, I'd almost look at Elizabeth Warren as a splitter, a divisive. Her campaign was about divisiveness. When she starts calling Bernie a liar and sexist, it's like that was not uniting the progressives. That was actually splitting, trying to split the progressive vote in the primaries in order to make sure that Bernie couldn't win. Because as we know, Elizabeth Warren is a neoliberal, not actually a progressive, but she still was able to take a lot of votes from Bernie, and that's why she stayed in. So if you look at, and then I'd actually look at Bernie as more of an agitator, because he was, especially in the 2016 campaign, he actually came out and said, Hillary Clinton is not qualified to be president. And, just look at her history. Here's why. She's giving these speeches to Wall Street. She's, owned by the donors. She's a hawk, all of this. And I wish he would have done more with Joe Biden. But, that was more of agitation because it united the people against the establishment. And it also shook things up, because this is something, you don't hear that very often in a presidential debate where they say, oh, well, my opponent is actually unqualified to be president.
Yeah. Yeah. So it might be slightly reductionist to put it this way, but I like the way you just framed that with, I think the difference may be, or one of the differences may be, an agitator, the division that the agitator creates is between the people and the establishment, whereas the divisiveness, like someone who's divisive, is creating divides between people or between popular movements. And I think that's a really key distinction to make. On that Bernie, I've always been puzzled by Bernie in a sense. And I volunteered for his campaign. I supported both of his campaigns. I knew Stephanie Kelton was his top economic advisor, so I knew he must understand MMT, or else he would have picked another economist, right? So I've always been confused by Bernie's framing of some of his policy issues, where while he doesn't go as far as a lot of establishment politicians do to buy into the tax to spend thing, he clearly would answer those questions in a tax to spend way. And I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on, do you think that's just an old dog isn't going to learn new tricks? Do you think he's playing to his audience? What's your view on why he's framing things that way?
I don't have any real insight into, Bernie's thinking. My only theory would be that, he needed an answer that he could give in a, 30-second, 60-second soundbite on a debate stage, and trying to explain MMT, which is something that maybe he doesn't even have that good of a grasp on, is something that he couldn't give in a 30 seconds when they give him a, how are you going to pay for it? So when he comes up with this like 4% payroll tax for Medicare for all, that's something that he can easily answer and defend on a debate stage, or he's on news shows or whatever. But that's,
yeah, I mean, politics is, you got to be able to put it on a bumper sticker kind of a thing. Unfortunately, I mean, it leaves people who take a deeper view on things in a place where it's harder to explain our positions. And the other one, you brought up Elizabeth Warren. I'm just curious, do you think like when she first hit the scene, she clearly was like the lefty of lefties in some regard, because she was fighting Biden on the bankruptcy bill, and she, came up with a lot of progressive rhetoric. Do you think she was always what she is now, or do you think she evolved? What's your, I'm obviously just asking your opinion. I know you don't have, any particular source on that, but what's your view on the evolution of Elizabeth Warren, or was it an evolution?
She's always been an opportunist. If you look at, like, deeper into her career, you can go back and see her giving speeches to the Federalist Society. So she was not left then. You look at her using her, story of Cherokee blood to be, Harvard's first female woman of color professor. She's always been willing to take advantage of what she can to advance her own interests. So, it's like fighting the bankruptcy bill. I think that gave a name for her. And I do think in some ways she's interested in what she considers to be like a more fair system of capitalism. But, she's also a market capitalist by her own admission, her own words. She always says, I'm a capitalist.
Yeah.
So I don't think she has a real understanding of the exploitation that's inherent in the capitalist system. So her idea was to uphold the capitalist system and make it a little bit more fair.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair analysis. I wanted to also ask you about, you guys brought up in this article, you brought up Fadl Kaboob's theory of like kind of a layer cake of policies, and how they really kind of have to build on each other. And I think we progressives often find ourselves in a position where when we're talking about one of our core policies, someone will find what they perceive as a gap in that policy, and we have to kind of answer it with, no, but we also want this, or we also want that, and it starts to kind of be difficult to message. Can you talk a little bit about how that layer cake applies to our policy proposals, and how we might effectively explain that to people?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that was so great about Bernie's campaign, was that he brought these different policies to the forefront. Like, Medicare for all is great, but by itself, it's not enough. And then same with the Green New Deal. And I think the most important part about the Green New Deal, other than just addressing climate change in general, is that it included a federal jobs guarantee, which is a major, major position that we have to get behind, because this addresses unemployment, it addresses the minimum wage. So fight for 15 is old news. I'd much rather have a federal jobs guarantee that starts with a whatever the number might be. It could be 15, but I think now we need to look more at $20 to $25 an hour minimum wage. And if the federal government had a option to work for them with community-based labor, communities get together and decide what they need in their community, and then the federal government pays for it, then we wouldn't even need to address the minimum wage laws, because if you have someone who's looking for work, they could say, oh, here, my community needs cleanup in the park. when we're going to do it for $25 an hour, okay, great. And this would force corporations to make concessions on minimum wages. So I think the federal jobs guarantee is something that's overlooked pretty often, and it was a key part of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think similarly to how you just described it, the minimum wage would no longer be required because it would effectively, the floor would be set by the program. And that also applies to other elements of the workplace, right? Like if you fight for 15, it's not that I don't support that. I want to raise the minimum wage too. But say we rose the minimum wage even to 20, like say we succeeded magically tomorrow in doing that. Employers could still treat their workers like shit. I mean, Amazon could still abuse their workers while they pay them 20 an hour. If you have a jobs guarantee, you're also raising the floor on the treatment of workers, because now the floor has been set here and private sector has to match it. Can you just talk about how all-encompassing that policy actually would be in so many different regards?
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Amazon because, Bernie actually forced their hand into a $15 minimum wage, but then what they did was they cut benefits for their workers. I don't know all the details on that, but I assume it's stuff like healthcare plans and retirement plans. I know they cut a lot of the benefits, so they were able to get the headlines of, oh, we're offering $15 minimum wage, and then behind the scenes they were cutting out a lot of other expenses. So in reality, they were probably still benefiting from, still profiting off of exploiting labor in this case. But like a federal jobs guarantee, if you're working for your community, it's really what it does is it redefines what work is. And that's what people don't understand is like, oh, they're going to force us into some kind of like unnecessary busy jobs. Like, that's not what it is. This isn't like a mandate to have you go out and do something that's absolutely unnecessary. This is rather communities getting together and saying, what do we need in our community? I like the example of, like if someone's, street musician, they could get paid by the federal government to keep on being a street musician rather than busking and relying on donations from people. And we'd still have the benefit of having music in the subway or music in the park or on, street corners, whatever it might be. And this person would be doing what they want to do and still making a living. So.
And added benefit to that obviously is stimulating to the economy, because this person is now not dirt poor. Now they're able to maybe go get an apartment or participate in the economy, which then stimulates it elsewhere. And the last thing I really wanted to make sure that we discussed here is you mentioned in this article the race to the bottom, and this has been quite a sort of it's sparked some controversy, I suppose you could say, and I think that the topic of this article perhaps applies to some lefties who have taken a less than genuine critique of our position on race to the bottom. Can you just talk about where you think that sort of visceral response to our position comes from, and how it ties in with sort of the anti-intellectualism and the desire for unity over truth, I suppose, if that's maybe oversimplifying, but somewhat true.
Yeah, I mean, this has mainly come up with, state-run healthcare initiatives where they expect a state to be able to somehow fund a universal healthcare program on a, state-based level. And that's just something that's not going to be possible when we take into consideration the fact that states aren't currency issuers. And I think a lot of people like the idea. It's like, I want to be able to have universal health care, and we know Joe Biden's not going to give it to us. So it's great to be able to get behind a state-based effort, but I just see that as something that's designed to fail because it's going to require raising taxes. And, capital flight is a real thing. There's plenty of evidence that, look at Amazon headquarters when they're shopping, all these states are trying to give them, bribes, essentially saying, oh, well, if you come to our state and you're going to bring in so many jobs, we'll give you all these tax breaks to bring your headquarters in here. And I think there's, a little bit of pushback on that now, but it's still like, states
very much
are,
a phenomenon. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I live in Washington State. We lost a lot of the Boeing production went to, I want to say North Carolina. It might be, I think it's North Carolina. And now with Amazon too. So it's, I mean, regardless of what you think about these businesses, you also can't just have bunches of people losing their jobs and having these jobs, moving around the country constantly. That's not a healthy state for anyone to exist within, and it leaves poor states out to dry effectively. I mean, which hence the term race to the bottom. I think it's an incredibly important topic to continue to cover. Birrion, can you tell people where they can find your work?
Yeah, you can. I have a Substack. It's birrion.substack.com, and then you can also, find my author page at Real Progressives.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've had Birrion's Twitter. It's just at Birrion. You got a simple one there for yourself on Twitter. Make sure that you're following him. He's putting out tons of fantastic content, you guys, and really want to encourage everybody to go to our website and find all sorts of great articles. Birrion, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. Nice talking.
What a great segment. Really want to encourage everybody, as we just did at the end of that interview, go to realprogressives.org, find all sorts of great articles, and go to Birrion's Substack as well. He's always putting out great content, great pieces. So we have another, unfortunately, less than positive story to discuss. Joe Biden, who claimed he would listen to science, has expanded offshore drilling in the Gulf. So I have an article here. This is in the Daily Poster. It's by Walker Bregman. Does not present sufficient cause is the name. Environmentalists slam the White House for brushing off the IPCC report and expanding offshore drilling. President Joe Biden has been touring climate-ravaged areas of America, warning that climate change is a code red emergency for the planet, and yet his administration has continued to boost fossil fuel projects and is now preparing to vastly expand offshore drilling. The White House argues that a court order it opposes and is appealing requires federal officials to lease more than 78 million acres of the Gulf of Mexico for fossil fuel exploration. Environmental groups, however, assert that federal law gives the administration broad discretion over whether or not to hold such sales. In fact, Biden's officials have instead used that power to officially declare that the warnings in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report does not present sufficient cause to reevaluate the drilling plan. With the help of the nonprofit public interest organization Earth Justice, several environmental and Gulf groups have now launched a lawsuit against the administration to stop the Gulf lease sale. The complaint argues that the environmental analysis behind the lease sale is based on outdated and arbitrary science in violation of federal law. Quote, "We've been very patient with this administration," says Hallie Templeton, Deputy Legal Director of Friends of the Earth, one of the environmental groups involved in the litigation. "The honeymoon's over. It's now September. They've been in office for 8 months. It's time for them to show that they have priorities and are meaningfully going to move in the right direction." Undercutting the message, as Biden last week sounded the climate alarm during a tour of East Coast locales slammed by Hurricane Ida, his own administration was undercutting the message, moving forward with a fossil fuel lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico that began under Donald Trump's presidency. Announcement of the lease sale for more drilling arrived on the heels of a sobering new report from the IPCC, which warned of catastrophic weather-related consequences should the world's powers not radically decarbonize. The report pinned the blame for the crisis squarely on human activity, such as fossil fuel extraction. The UN's World Meteorological Organization also recently released a study indicating that weather-related natural disasters have increased fivefold over the last 4 decades. So, Biden here wants to message in one direction. He wants everybody to believe that he is a pro-science president and that he's prioritizing climate change and taking it seriously. And at the same time, he has no problem continuing to approve of, expanded offshore drilling. And again, I want to make clear, they're trying to walk a line where they say, no, it's not our fault. It's the court's fault. They're the federal fucking government. They have the authority here. And as these environmental groups have pointed out, in this case, they explicitly have the authority here. By the way, the courts don't enforce the laws, you guys. Never let the courts like dictate things to that degree, right? The courts play an important role, but they rely on the legislative body writes the laws that the courts enforce, and the executive branch enforces them. So when we're talking about an issue like the destruction of our fucking planet, never, ever, ever let someone as powerful as Joe Biden tell you, well, I just can't do it because of the courts. Bullshit. Bullshit. Nothing else to say about that. Also want to plug the Daily Poster there. They do some fantastic reporting. And this was a very important piece. We need to hold Biden accountable for this stuff. When he entered office, by the way, you guys, just to demonstrate what his intents on this very clearly are, they canceled what they basically disapproved. You refused to authorize one very popular, or popular is the wrong word, one pipeline which was garnering a lot of public attention. So when they want good media, they'll pretend to, or in a micro sense, do the right thing. And then after he canceled that pipeline, I'm blanking on the name of it now, but it was garnering protests and it was actually getting public attention. So he cancels that one and says, I'm going to be on the side of environmentalists. And then he approved like over a dozen new drilling permits. So, and that part goes quietly because those were permits that weren't getting the kind of public attention that the first one was. You can see right there in just one little anecdote what the Biden administration's goals are here and how unseriously they are taking the climate crisis. They also, I mean, Joe could do a number of things to bring the Joe Manchins of the world on board with the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package, and he is not, at least to what we can see, he has not done that. He has not played hardball. Obviously I am not privy to the backdoor negotiations. You guys are the closed door, negotiations. But it seems pretty clear that Biden is trying to play nice with the Joe Manchins and the Kristen Sinemas of the world instead of playing hardball with them. And with what's going on with Joe Manchin right now, you guys, Kyle Kulinski got a lot of shit for saying this. I think he's damn right. With everything going on, all of the allegations against Manchin and his wife and his daughter pertaining to her pharmaceutical company in West Virginia. It seems, price gouging schemes and all this kind of shit on life-saving medication. It seems pretty obvious that the move is to say, hey, Joe, I'm in charge of the Department of Justice, my dude. You see the news about your daughter. Do the right thing or else we're going to go as hard as we possibly can. I mean, it's so easy. Now, people criticized Kyle for saying that, like, oh, you're going to play corrupt politics and this and that. To save the planet? Yes. Yes, we should. We should play hardball to save the fucking planet. If that's a weird take on the left, I honestly don't even know what to say. Yes, of course, Joe Biden should use the leverage that this story and this corruption gives him about Joe Manchin. Seems pretty obvious. That $3.5 trillion, it's inadequate. We even mentioned it in that interview there with Birrion. It's inadequate. It's not even close to adequate, but it does address the climate crisis in a way that we have not in any way, shape, or form done to this point. So anyhow, I got a little worked up about that because this is our fucking planet. We will not have a habitable planet if we don't like drastically alter our path. And Joe Biden, who has the power to do that, has refused for 8 months. And now again is refusing to use his power to stop the expansion of offshore drilling in the Gulf. I'm sure a number of you saw that Gavin Newsom beat the polls by quite a bit to avoid being recalled. I just wanted to touch on this. I've covered it a little bit lately. He ended up do not recall, 63.4%. The yes, 36.6%. This is according to NBC News with 84% reporting. That blows the polls out of the water, guys. And the reason I wanted to mention it is I think it explains, or I think it indicates a couple of sort of political wins, I suppose you could say. Typically, over the last few election cycles, if you're analyzing polling averages, you should probably give 3, 4, 5, something like that points to the Republicans compared to what the polls are saying. That's just how the last couple of election cycles have gone. Donald Trump obviously beating the polls in a number of key states in 2016 to win election. And also, in 2020, there were states that were a lot closer than the polls had them, even if Biden still won them. So the typical rule is give Republicans 3 or 4 points. So when we were looking at the polling maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it was looking pretty even, it looked like, boy, Newsom might be recalled, okay? But he actually beat the polls in this case, which is not typical of modern or recent politics. And I think one of the things that happened is this recall process is deeply flawed. It's a very faulty process. It's really kind of just fugazi, quite frankly, in that there wasn't an opponent attached to the recall. So there were 2 questions that voters were asked. The first is, should we recall Newsom, yes or no? And then regardless of how you answered that question, you got to vote for who would replace Newsom should he be recalled. So it's an incredibly undemocratic democratic process in the sense that theoretically, Newsom could have barely lost the recall. Like, he could have gotten 49% to 51, barely lost the recall. And then Larry Elder might have gotten 25% of the vote on the next layer of this process, and he could beat Newsom. So if you think about that, that would be Larry Elder receiving 25% of the vote and Newsom receiving 49% of the vote and Larry Elder winning. It's a deeply flawed process. It's really fugazi. It's really just theater. Okay. And I think the Democrats are probably going to very quickly change the recall process in California because of that. But that's just a kind of a side point. What I think happened politically here is I think that Newsom, the Republicans originally thought that this process would benefit them because there are a number of people on the left and a number of independents and moderates who do not like Gavin Newsom. So they thought if they could detach the extremity of Larry Elder from the vote, that they might get some lefties and independents to vote with the recall and then vote for a losing candidate while all the Republicans consolidated behind Larry Elder. So for them, it looked like a process that was just like, built for them to win. And what I think happened is this shows you guys just how polarizing of a figure Donald Trump is. There is nothing that bring out the Democrats or the liberals to vote quite like Donald Trump. They, as Sagar and Jetty put it the other day, the liberals will crawl over broken glass to get to the polls to vote against someone that they perceive as a Trumpian candidate. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to that effect, and I think it's correct. So as soon as Newsom and the Democrats started to attach Elder to Trump, and that's what Newsom would say at every appearance he was doing. It's what they were running ads that showed a picture of Larry Elder with Donald Trump and calling him, the next Trump. It's what Biden said when he went to campaign in California. It's what Obama said in an ad that he cut for Gavin Newsom. So I'm interested in this from a political perspective, in the sense that it appears that the Democrats are going to continue to run against Donald Trump and try to attach every Republican to Donald Trump. And unfortunately for the left, that can justify a corporate candidate over a leftist. This is what they tried to do to Bernie in 16 and in 20 is play up a disingenuous and faulty narrative that Bernie or a leftist has a lower likelihood of winning in a general, and then fear-mongering about the Republican and connecting him to Donald Trump. That leaves us in an unfortunately disadvantaged position based upon how the Democrats and liberals have responded to that kind of messaging, and we see it again here in California with Newsom beating the polls and surviving the recall quite easily, even though it looked like a few weeks ago he might not. Now, I want to be clear. I'm about as critical of Newsom as anybody. The guy's an absolute fraud. He's corporate friendly. His good friends are lobbyists. He famously went to the French Laundry to celebrate his lobbyist buddy's 50th birthday, violating his own COVID protocols. One of the things that turned a lot of voters against him. He too ran on I was just talking about Biden and drilling. Gavin Newsom also ran on a green energy platform and then turned around and approved a whole bunch of new drilling permits. So not a progressive, not a candidate that I like, not a governor that I like. But at the same time, Larry Elder is insane, you guys. He's not just off his rocker. He fell across the floor. He opposes any minimum wage. Like, he's that extreme. He supported the Texas abortion ban. He's like, I mean, the guy is not like a sane human being when it comes to his political views. So it's not that I want Gavin Newsom to survive, and I hate the fact that our political environment leaves us pitted against each other like this, and that the Democrats get to basically hide behind how awful the Republican Party is and how off the cliff to the right the Republican Party is. But in this circumstance, I want the left to organize around a better candidate and run against Newsom that way. This recall was bound to be disastrous for the left. And as I mentioned, it actually had implications in the Senate as well. Dianne Feinstein obviously is, I believe, in her 90s and has had some serious issues. I mean, memory issues and things like that have been reported by her staff. So it's entirely possible that she doesn't finish her term. And if she were to not finish her term, then the governor of California gets to replace her temporarily until an election season comes around. So it would have been absolutely disastrous. As much as I cannot stand Gavin Newsom, it would have been absolutely disastrous to have Larry Elder picking her replacement. There would have been no leverage left for the left to use that Democratic majority to whatever benefits, as inadequate as they may be, can come from that. And I hope that the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill will be one of those benefits, but I can guarantee you, if you replace Dianne Feinstein with a far-right Republican, you're not going to get that. So, anyhow, Newsom survives quite easily. Now the onus is now on the left to take advantage of his, I think, remaining unpopularity and usurp him in whenever he comes up for re-election. And the last story I wanted to talk about today, you guys, the show Cops was taken off the air in response to the George Floyd murder and the protests and movement from Black Lives Matter that came up in the months following. And now it's going back on the air. Cops, by the way, if you guys haven't seen, I think the documentary was called Running from Cops. They eviscerated the show, basically accused and demonstrated how the show takes advantage of poor people, forges signatures or manipulates them into allowing the content to be used, how it incentivizes cops to be as barbaric as possible, even on their scale of barbarity, which is already kind of off the charts. Basically, they feel the need to put a show on, right? Which is not how you want law enforcement to be conducting themselves. And it obviously doubles as classist and racist propaganda against marginalized and impoverished communities that are portrayed in a very particular way in this show. And it also doubles as pro-police propaganda as well. So this article's in The Guardian. Cops is coming back, and that's a depressing sign of the times. This is by Charles Bramesco. Canceled during last summer's protests, the much maligned reality series will return, a sadly predictable sign of a too brief cultural reckoning. Last summer, amid a state of protests against overzealous policing that erupted in more police violence, which only proved their necessity, the silver lining was supposed to be the promise of lasting change. Judging by the impassioned op-eds flying every which way, the demonstrations had triggered a hyper jump in mainstream awareness, with average Americans considering for the first time that there may be irreparable institutional rot at the root of nationwide law enforcement. Statistics about disproportionate racial dynamics in arrests, harassment of mentally disabled individuals incapable of advocating for themselves, and other damning perspectives on the job came pouring out, fundamentally altering the perception of the cop in the public imagination. The image of trustworthy, competent heroes forming a thin blue line between society and anarchy began to fade, and the hope was that a more sober-minded critique could take its place. There's no better bellwether for this presumed shift than Cops, the long-running TV series documenting on-duty encounters between the fuzz and real-life perps. Over 30 years, the show promoted the dedication and fearlessness of the officers on camera while minimizing the harm of their aggressive methods, sometimes even playing it off as humor. The footage courted scandal over the entirety of its run, but the objections that the show valorized in brutal protocols never held water until 2020. Its shortcomings and selective framings were recognized to an unprecedented degree, compelling Paramount to read the room and pull the 33rd season. Those inclined toward cultural analysis took it as a positive sign, a step on the path to enlightenment. But there's a magical place where none of this progress stuck, a right-wing never land that allows aggrieved conservatives to hear their opinions parroted back to them and affirmed as unassailably correct, in which the recent developments in social justice can look more like a passing fad than a step in political evolution. Cops has found a home in the bosom of Fox News Media, according to this week as the new host, announced this week as the new host of for fresh episodes of the series. There are murmurs that A&E's like-minded reality program Live PD may also be coming back. Despite this ideological faction's wariness of snowflakes, the streaming platform Fox Nation will provide a safe space, not just for the wayward TV property, but for the increasingly obsolete school of thought it represents. I love that last little jab at the end about their snowflake rhetoric. There's no bigger snowflakes, by the way, you guys, than like the religious far right or than law enforcement or like the people who will most say things like calling others snowflakes or crying cancel culture. They're almost always the very first people to engage in the behavior that they criticize. It's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. Tell a cop that you think that their profession does harm to society and see how they respond. It'll be about as snowflakey as any response you can get from anybody. There was a specific case, and I wish I knew the names involved, but an officer had a woman pulled over in an episode of Cops, went back to the trunk and found some like dust or I don't know, some sort of like substance that they thought were drugs. They tested it. It came back negative, and then they went and tested it again, and it came back positive for cocaine. Seems pretty obvious that they planted evidence or in other ways manipulated things in a way that allowed them to put on a show for the cameras at the expense of this woman's livelihood. And who knows how many times that story or a similar one was executed in the show's duration. So this is horrendous, you guys. All of those police dramas, the fucking Blue Bloods and you know, Law and Order and all this NCIS, all this shit. Watch it if you must, but please know what you're watching. They present law enforcement in a very particular way. And my biggest beef with them, those shows tend to involve very regularly in their storylines instances where police break the law or violate their own protocol, but it's presented in a way where you know it's a good guy and you know that they're trying to do the right thing. And then you will apply that subconsciously to real life stories that you hear about law enforcement. So then when you hear that they violate protocol, that they beat people up and murder people and violate the law, all this shit, asset forfeiture, all this shit, you hear about it and your mind goes to a place where you're like, well, I bet they were trying to do the right thing. This propaganda it's quite explicit. It's nauseating and it's really an indication of our ignorance as a nation, the extent to which these shows are successful. So I want to encourage everybody to avoid watching those police dramas and avoid watching shows like Cops that glorify law enforcement and exhibit on a routine basis classist and racist rhetorics and propaganda. So this is a shame. This is a real shame because we have not seen real change come from all of the protests resulting from George Floyd's death. Not just George Floyd. I want to be clear. Breonna Taylor also sparking a lot of outrage. And too many names to fucking list, you guys. This is part of the problem. We kill a few people a day in this country. Law enforcement kills a few people a day. Well over 1,000 a year. And so this problem is so massive that to see the kinds of protests that we saw and the kind of movement that we saw from Black Lives Matter last summer and extending beyond the summer, to see that not bear any fruit, and then to see one of the small pieces of fruit that it did bear be retracted, have cops come back on the air and Live PD come back on the air. What a disgrace. It makes my stomach churn. So, you know, don't watch these shows. Try to explain to people in your lives how these shows operate and what they do to public discourse and how they poison our discourse about police and about law enforcement and racism. This is just really too bad. I really fucking hate to see this. It's, you know, it might seem like a small thing, but I think it's an indication of a broader problem and a lack of response to what we saw last summer. So just really too bad. One more time, guys, want to make sure everybody checks out the new Untouchables tonight with Dennis Kucinich, 8 p.m. Eastern on Real Progress in Action YouTube. I will be there. I hope to see all of you there. realprogressives.org if you want to learn more about us, find our articles, find our podcasts, contribute to our Patreon. Make sure you're going to our website. And with that, I will call it a stream. I'll see you all next week. Hope everybody has a good one.